he is. He waved it away, as he leaned back. The northerner still didn't seem to notice that they weren't equals here. If he wanted, he could have all their heads on pikes and the town behind them in flames before nightfall. Their ignorance amused him. Was this the great Robb Stark? Well, then I guess you could help me with a few things. The northerner spoke. For the sake of argument, he engaged him. Things such as, "This attack on my lands will not stand," Stark declared, his voice suddenly turning to ice. This surprised him. Many of his friends had expected the man to beg. "We have received information that Lord Folly is amongst your host. He led the Reach forces into the Riverlands. We want his head, as well as those of all Riverlanders you are harboring. I want you to release my vassals that were captured, especially the families Parrell and Menning. Afterwards, I want all your forces to move south of the Gold Road within the week." The man continued in his icy tone. He had difficulty to keep his composure. Some of his friends didn't have the same restraint. Humphrey and Osgood burst out laughing. He simply smiled. "Anything else that you would want from me?" The northerner voiced in his rough accent. "I want you to go to Old Town and arrest the High Septon. I want you to deliver him to me so I can execute him here in the Riverlands for his crimes against its people." This shocked all his companions. "You want to execute the head of the faith?" he asked, not knowing if he heard that right. "No, I want to execute a mass murderer who has given the order to murder women and children by the tens of thousands because he can't control them under his septons. I want to execute the leader of a warband that entered my lands with 4,000 men. He needs to die. I will respect your sovereignty and allow you to get him, otherwise I would need to march on Old Town." Stark replied, icy cold dripping from his voice and face. This angered him beyond reason. His eyes turned to slits. "I think you are mistaken which kind of meeting this is, Stark. I have 60,000 men at my back, you have no one. Even if you were to gather the rest of the Riverlands and North, my army would still outnumber and outclass you. What will happen is this. You will release all prisoners from the Reach that you captured in the battle, first and foremost my cousin Morin. Then you will sign a treaty with me that reconfirms House Tyrell's ownership of its rightful lands north of the Gold Road, which you unjustly stole from us. Thirdly, you will allow the Riverlords in my company to return to their possessions without penalties. If you don't agree with these commands, I will burn the Riverlands." Robb Stark didn't even flinch. "Go ahead, try and burn the Riverlands then," he replied with a smile. "Your uncle and grandfather held similar ideas once, before I destroyed their armies here in the Riverlands. You never defeated my grandfather. Lord Randil Tarly was never beaten." He spat back. The Stark King threw his head back and laughed loudly, his companions joining him. Stark suddenly got up and looked him in the eyes. What he saw were the eyes of a cold-blooded killer. "Oh, you think yourself to be Randil Tarly come again?" "No, boy. I meant your other grandfather. Lord Mace Tyrell and his favorite son Loras Tyrell died here in these lands on different fields. Their armies outnumbered me greatly, but I beat every one of them except for Lord Tarlis who fled back to the Reach to deal with rebels. Rebels you sent to our homeland to destroy us." Daikon Tarly threw back. Robb Stark shrugged. "It seems that you have learned a thing or two from me. It is the same thing you did here in the Riverlands. Well, you failed. The only difference is that I won't let it stand, whereas your father had to. Besides, I couldn't even meet your demands if I wanted to do so." This got his attention. "Why is that?" "Joining a religious military order is punishable by death in my kingdom, as it is in most of Westeros. A law that has been as old as the kingdom itself. All those fighting under the banner of the Faith Militant have been executed. Those Reachmen that freely joined Lord Folly have been sent to the wall. There is no one to release." The savage smiled. "You executed my brother," his cousin Leo screamed, as he threw his chair back. Now the giant lord stood up as well. The Umber giant smiled cruelly. "No, I did," the smiling giant confessed. "After joining that wretched order, he forswore all his lands and titles. He was no Tyrell anymore. He was a crazy fanatic, and his head rots on one of Riverrun's gates now where it should. If you have any problems with that, you can join him there. Umber threatened his cousin, as guards of all sides ran into the room. Before any of them could reach him, 2 giant direwolves jumped upon the table. The grey one growled loudly, the other one silently bared its teeth. I would propose that it is time to go, King Tyrell. You know my demands. If your army marches any further, this will be interpreted as an attack on my kingdom. I have destroyed and humbled many houses that are more prestigious than House Tyrell, don't make me do it to you too. The gall on that man. As if this fucking savage could even be worthy of walking Highgarden's prestigious halls bound as a prisoner. Nevertheless, this was not the setting. With those beasts, they could all be killed before their army got here. He calmed himself and called to his men. This meeting is over. Men, we return to the camp. All strode outside, flanked by guards. He himself looked back at Stark. I'll see you on the battlefield, Stark. I hope that you are half as good as they say that you are. I want you to give the singers something to sing about after you are dead. The Northerner never replied, as he turned around towards his horse. Immediately, they all rode back to their forces, while cursing the bunch of savages they had just met. The next day. What is the meaning of this? He shouted loudly, as the representatives of Stony September kneeled in front of him. He had been urgently called to the front of their vanguard. Why he did not know. He couldn't even see any of the enemy soldiers yet. Had they gathered on the plains behind the town? The men at his feet looked frightened. One spoke up. We are surrendering the town to you without a fight, King Tyrell. In return, we hope that you spare it. It has already seen too much strife these past 50 years. How can you be surrendering the town? Where is Robb Stark? He and his army were at Stony September yesterday. He is camped just behind it. How did you get here to surrender it without him catching you? He fired off his questions. Now the man looked equally confused. Your Highness, most of the Stark and Tully army had left the town days before your arrival. Only 1,000 men and most of their camp remained by the time you came. At night, they retreated north under the leadership of King Robb. I do not know where, but I would presume Riverrun. He let that information sink in. We have been betrayed. Lord Gerald Hightower exclaimed, as his lords began discussing loudly amongst themselves. He grinded his teeth. He had waited for a day to do battle, as was common chivalry. In hindsight, he shouldn't have expected it from these heathens. Who are you? He finally asked the man in front of him. He looked like one of the small folk. Why was he here? I am the head of the Smithies Guild of Stony September, Your Highness. The man replied, anxious to keep his head down. He frowned. Why was a commoner bringing him this news? He asked the man, but his answer frustrated him even more. All nobles and many esteemed citizens fled the town long before your arrival on the orders of King Robb, Your Highness. Stark had prepared this long before his coming. He had never intended to do battle with him here. He had given up the entire area long before his arrival. The question was, why would he do that? His spies had told him about the second mobilization of the North. Thousands more men would be joining him from Moat Cailin. The most obvious answer was that he would retreat and wait for these reinforcements. Nonetheless, this would leave the Riverlands open for him to plunder. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Please, Your Highness. Our town has lost people on both sides of the civil war already. We just want peace. The smith told him. He turned his head sharply towards him and looked at him, as the thoughts flooded his head. That savage wouldn't have, would he? I need a map of all houses of the Riverlands immediately. He ordered loudly to no one in particular. Squires scrambled around him to find him a map, as his uncle Daikon walked up to him. What do we do with this lot? He asked him, as he pointed to the group of small folk on their knees. Let them be. He waved. They have to pay, let's say 1,000 gold coins worth of food and accept our garrison in their town. In return, we won't hurt their people. You are more than kind, Your Highness. Another one of the small folk spoke. However, King Robb took all the extra food that we had in the town with him. We only have enough to feed ourselves for a few months. Please, allow us to pay you the sum in other means. He grew angrier and angrier. Stark had seen to it that he couldn't use the town's supplies to feed his army. He waved the man away. You can pay me in other means, now get out of here. All men bowed multiple more times while thanking him for his generosity and running away. Stark had planned all of this. He growled and his uncle Daikon nodded. I told you not to underestimate him, Garland. I know that most of your friends and court deem him a savage, and it may be true, but he remains a talented military general. We can beat him, but not if we let him surprise us at every turn. That is how he managed to beat the Lannisters. To his own dismay, he had to agree with the Lord of Horn Hill. This will be the last time that he surprises me, uncle. I won't fall for it this easily anymore. Uncle Daikon nodded approvingly. At that point, a Rowan squire brought him a map of all the houses of the Riverlands and their territories. He scanned those between Stony September and Riverrun and cursed aloud. Damn that savage to the seven hells. What is it? His uncle asked him, as many of his lords and friends gathered around him. Nearly all of the houses between here and Riverrun have either supported Elmar or stayed neutral in the civil war in the Riverlands. Which one of the two doesn't matter, they all betrayed Stark. In return, he is giving up their lands to us. I wouldn't be surprised to find villages deserted, food stocks emptied, and wells poisoned for the next 100 miles. He growled. Uncle Daikon took the map from him, as he contemplated his words. Lords Hightower, Oakurt, Redwine and Ashford looking over his shoulder to do the same. Rowan, his cousin Leo and many others just started cursing as well. What do we do now? Lord Hobber Redwine asked him. He wants us to march into the Riverlands. He wants us to fight him where he knows the terrain. We will give him what he wants, but we will do it on our terms. He answered grimly. Lord Ashford, Lord Risley. He called out, until both men stood in front of him. Take 1,000 men. Ashford will march to the keep that belonged to the Parrells, Risley to the Mennings. The only good thing those Riverlanders did to these lands was fortify those two keeps. I expect you to fix up their defenses and leave a garrison and supplies to withhold a siege for months. Our supply lines need to be protected at all costs. We need to hold both in our possession. Leave your brothers in command of the castles. They are both capable. Yes, your grace. Both men bowed, before running away to prepare their departure. Hightower. He called over his cousin. Yes, your grace. His friend immediately responded, as he walked to his side. Make arrangements to do the same with Stony September. Its storages may be empty, but we can still use them to bring our supplies much closer to our forces. I want the town to be armed to the teeth. Give one of your vassals command over the garrison, whoever you see fit. It will be done, your grace. Lord Gerald Hightower bowed, before walking off with long strides. All the others, set up camp around Stony September, use the place of the enemy encampment. Turn it over first, but I would imagine it to be useful. We will stay here for a few days, while we decide our supply situation and battle plans. Afterwards, we march deeper into the Riverlands. We will force Robb Stark to do battle, even if we must burn everything between here and Riverrun to achieve this. He declared, and all men around him scattered to take personal command of their men. Chapter 91, Tactical Retreat. 28-29 AC. Robb. He sat in Riverrun Solar, putting the finishing touches to his plan to retreat. The Tyrells had done what he had expected of them after his earlier retreat from Stony September. They had marched into the Riverlands, plundering and looting while looking for his weakened force to try and force a quick direct engagement. He had anticipated this and made it impossible for them to get what they wanted. He had let them come. All harvests between Riverrun and Stony September had been carted away long before he had met the Tyrell King in Stony September. They had poisoned wells and burned many possibilities to scavenge food in the area. Even the castles hadn't been allowed to retain much of their stocks, although he had allowed those families that wished to remain there to do so. All of the local houses, except for House Goodwood, had broken the vows they had made to him in the past civil war. He wouldn't shed a tear if their lands burned. Pink Maiden, Wayfarer's Rest and Acorn Hall had quickly fallen to the enemy. House Goodwood's lands were also taken by the Tyrells, but only after tens of thousands of people had been evacuated from them. This morning, he had gotten the news that Atlanta had fallen too. Some of his lords had been astounded by his strategy, but he knew that it would work. Facing the Tyrells head-on with his remaining 22,000 men plus a few thousand riverlords with uncertain loyalties was asking for disaster. Every day that passed, his reinforcements from the north got closer. Every mile the Tyrells marched, their supply lines became more and more stretched, and their forces dwindled from all the garrisons they had to leave behind. He also had a few surprises planned this time. He had written to his allies 8 weeks ago, and that was now paying off massively. A few days ago, a raven had arrived announcing the departure of the Ironborn under Lord Harris Harlaw from their islands with a fleet of over 150 ships. Thousands of Ironborn were on their way to the Shield Islands to recover their lost glory. At the same time, the Lannisters had started raiding the lands of Houses Lake and Oakert. Soon, King Willem Lannister would invade with at least 15,000 soldiers. That wasn't all. King Consort Edric Baratheon of the Stormlands had called his banners. Soon, he would set the fertile valleys between the Cockleswent and the Blueburn rivers aflame. King Edric's 2 eldest sons would march together with him, amongst them his future godson Stannis. He had spent years nurturing his alliances and had made many a sacrifice to keep them. Only recently, he had released the Lefford and Payne prisoners for ransoms instead of executing them. A thing which some of his lords had openly criticized. Let them. This way, he would win the war. The only allies who had proven to be disappointing had been the Arryns. King Harold Arryn had apparently refused to come to his aid. His official explanation for this was religion, as the Tyrells seemed to have the approval from the High Septon in their holy war. His spies whispered of letters from Old Town flying into the Eyrie for weeks on end. Nevertheless, politics were almost certainly a part of it too. The Arryns had no way to expand either geographically or trade-wise in any direction because of his realm. Harold probably saw an opportunity to weaken his kingdom and create a more opportune situation for the future. Nonetheless, that had proven a miscalculation. The king's own good brother, Lord Andor Royce, had called his banners and those of his allies in his own name. It had never been clearer how much power House Royce wielded in the Vale than now. In a show of strength, Lord Andor had not only raised his own banners and those of all his vassals. No, the Redforts, Waynwoods, Donishers, Upcliffs, Melcombs, Egens and Templetons had also raised men for their cause. All those houses were related to Lord Andor through marriage, except for the Templetons who joined out of friendship. In total, 9,000 soldiers were now gathering at the Bloody Gate, and there was nothing that Harold Arryn could do about it. Many of those houses, especially the Redforts, Waynwoods, and Templetons had very good relations with other houses that hadn't joined House Royce's coalition. This left the Arryns without enough allies to make a move against the coalition if he wished to do so. Moreover, those 9,000 weren't all the troops these houses could muster. Thousands remained at home to protect their lands. Lord Andor himself remained in Runestone to monitor the situation in the Vale, while his heir Allard would lead the army. Allard was his daughter Berrina's husband. A good and capable young man whose lack of experience would be countered by the presence of Lords Redfort, Templeton and Donisher. Already, Tyrell's vanguard was advancing on Riverrun. Most of his own army had already retreated towards Raventree, and he would join them in a few hours. He would let Garland Tyrell come and he would grant him the last victory of his weeks of invincibility. Weeks where he thought himself the greatest conqueror in the history of Westeros would soon come to an end. While his armies rested and resupplied in Raventree, they would be joined by 18,000 Northerners who had already started marching down the causeway. While his army would grow to almost the size of that of the Tyrells, the Reach would be attacked from all sides. The Lannisters would attack in the northwest, the Ironborn from the sea in the west and the Baratheons from the east. He had even written to Princess Arianne Martell to organize raiding parties into the Reach. These letters had gone unanswered, but you never knew with the Dornish. What he did know was that the Dornish borderlords had also been recipients of letters from the Starry September. Because of this, he wasn't counting on any support from the south. In the span of a week the armies of the Reach would find themselves overstretched in enemy territory. They would have suddenly lost their significant numerical advantage, while their homeland was burning. That is when he would strike, not a second earlier. He looked forward to that moment, and it was near. When it came, the Reach would burn. He would not stop at his side of the Gold Road, as the Tyrells hadn't stopped at their side. The Reach would burn. His men would only march north again when their pockets were filled with gold, the Faith Militant was destroyed, and the Reach was on its knees. Garland Tyrell would feel the wrath that his father had been spared. He had made peace with Willers Tyrell in the understanding that his sons would not have to go to war if he did. Now, both his sons sported battle scars and his nephew was still recovering from a near-death experience. No, this would not stand. Highgarden would be humbled and diminished in power until they weren't a threat anymore. That was the only way peace in the Riverlands could be achieved. Giving Riverrun over to a siege was a hard sacrifice to make, but it was a necessary one. Lord Hoster had agreed to the strategy, but only if he himself led the defense of Riverrun. A mistake, in his eyes, but he would not stop him. As an extra safety measure, he had reinforced the garrison of Riverrun with Northmen from Winterfell, Barrowton and Hornwood. None of those would ever surrender, and they were well prepared for a siege. The stocks of food and ammunition were filled to the brim, all non-essential people were evacuated and the morale of his Northmen was high. On top of that, Riverrun was almost impossible to siege with its situation between the rivers. Tyrell also wouldn't be able to bypass Riverrun, as its large garrison would otherwise inflict horrendous damage to his rear. No, their situation was safe, even if the idea of Riverrun coming under siege again was horrible. Let the Tyrells think they were winning for now. They would get their revenge soon. He picked up the last of his documents, including his memoirs that he was writing. Years ago, he had written a first entry about the turbulent start of his reign and the wars against the Lannisters, Targaryens and Ironborn. After that he had always kept notes of his reign, but it had been less codified. When Rookie had turned 16, he had given him the first entry and to his surprise his son had read it cover to cover multiple times. When asked why, he had told him that he thought it incredibly instructive for what to do in certain situations and even as the Crown Prince it seemed to help him with his studies. That's when he had decided to keep documenting his reign as best he could. With the help of Winterfell's Maester, he had written a second book about the 2 decades of ruling he had done since he had gotten back north. That second entry went into detail about statecraft, diplomacy, settlement building and trade. Now, he was planning a third entry. He anticipated to be stuck in Raventree for several weeks. He might as well start writing everything from Elmar's rebellion down, now that it was still fresh in his memory. He was looking forward to the time when he could once again write about the construction of settlements and the clearing of forests, the importance of marriage alliances and the cultural intermingling taking place in White Harbor and Riverport. Yet, that would have to be something for a fourth entry. In the near future, all he would write about would be war. 10 days later. He smiled, as the last of the detachments of the Second Northern Army joined his forces under the early summer sun that the White Ravens had just announced. His son John had brought the whole of the north to him. Young boys from Barrowton and White Harbor, reserves that hadn't been mobilized on time from the lands of Houses Umber and Carstark and even the full might of the mountain clans and Scagassy had come. All men that they could logistically support. A strong garrison of 1,000 men remained in Moat Cailin and decent-sized garrisons in keeps along the shores, but otherwise the north had mostly emptied itself and he had never seen such a magnificent horde of men. In total, he now had 31,000 Northmen who were ready to fight. He also had 20,000 Riverlanders. The Riverlanders' numbers were lower as they had lost more men in Pink Maiden with Elmar's cavalry charges on their flank. Many of Elmar's troops had also come from the region, lowering its potential manpower. Lastly, raids had dwindled their troop numbers, together with the necessary garrisons he had had to leave behind. Nonetheless, it was a force he was proud of. It was a good mix of veterans and fresh men and the morale of his northerners had remained extremely high, especially with the reinforcements coming in. The Riverlanders' confidence had been lower, but they had been pacified by the idea that he had never before lost a battle or campaign. Moreover, the news from outside the Riverlands had raised the morale of all his men. The Lannisters had attacked the Reach in number. King Willem Lannister was sieging Red Lake himself, while his twin brother was traveling south along the ocean road and setting everything on fire he couldn't cart off back with him. At the same time, King Consort Edric Baratheon had also attacked. He had split his forces in two. one under himself and one under his heir, and with results. Edric had sacked the town of Grassy Vale and put Grassfield Keep under siege, while his son Robert had raided along the Coqueleswent and would soon put Ashford to siege. The former was the most interesting one. Grassy Vale was less than 150 miles from Bitterbridge. That castle was the centerpiece of the Tyrell supply line. All supplies from Highgarden to Stony September and the Riverlands passed through it. If it came under siege, Tyrell's 60,000 men would be cut off from any supplies, and then he could starve them into submission without ever having to do battle. Nevertheless, it probably wouldn't come to that. The past 2 days, his outriders had reported less skirmishes with the enemy, and the enemy force seemed to have stopped advancing after putting Riverrun and Leicester to siege. He interrupted his thoughts to greet the commanders of the northern rearguard personally at the border of the encampment. He clasped arms with Donald Selwyn, a second cousin of Lord Clee, and Ned Umber, Smalljohn's younger brother, who had finally joined the force together with his 2 young sons. Suddenly, Grey Wind barked heavily, as lines of soldiers passed into the camp. "What is it, boy?" he asked, as he pulled at the strings at the back of his head. "Pack." Grey's thoughts screamed at him so loudly that he was thrown back into his own head. His direwolf sped off, outside the palisade around their encampment. He howled loudly, and to his shock other direwolves joined him from all over the camp. He saw the younger direwolves Ash, Shadow and Fang chase after Grey Wind, but Nymeria, Lady, Ghost and Shaggy did the same. The column of marching soldiers stopped, as they looked upon 8 adult direwolves running off in the distance. Suddenly their howls were answered by a 9th direwolf in the distance. To others, it might have sounded as one of the 8, but he knew this howl to be an answer to the first ones. He shared a look with John and his sons, before shouting for a horse. Not much later, the 3 of them and a handful members of his Wolf's Guard were charging down the Blackwood Vale. A mile from camp, they came upon a scene he could never have imagined. 4 adult direwolves were roughhousing with each other, as 4 others had jumped upon a man. The man was laying on the ground, but the wolves didn't seem to hurt him. 2 men seemed nailed to the floor, but surprisingly they hadn't pulled their swords outside of their sheaths at the sight of Ghost slowly stalking around them. They rode on, and only when he called back Grey did the direwolves come to their senses. Ghost, Ash and Fang walked back to their owners, and Lady and Nymeria followed Grey obediently. Only Shadow continued to happily lick the man's face, as the other direwolf pushed his nose to his. He almost rubbed his eyes, as he recognized the direwolf as Summer. "Bran!" he called loudly. "Rob. It's me." His younger brother laughed, as he pushed himself up. He was dressed in brown riding attire. It was muddied and almost buried under direwolf hair. "What are you doing here? I told you to guard Moat Cailin," he exclaimed. John paid him no mind and jumped off his horse to embrace their brother. After a small unsure look at him, both his sons followed suit. He dismounted too, nodding respectfully to his brother's companions who were dressed equally inconspicuously. He embraced his brother, who was in the process of ridding himself of half a ton of direwolf hair. Bran pulled back and looked him in his eyes. "I apologize for disobeying your orders, Rob. Maybe I make a bad commander of Moat Cailin because of it, I don't know. However, I had to see my son. Alan and Benedict are dead and my son is badly wounded. I needed to see how he is doing. I only have one son, Rob. I can't lose him." He could see the hurt, uncertainty and despair in his brother's eyes and decided right there that he couldn't punish him for this. He just took him in his arms again. "Bryn is recovering well, but you will see him soon. He is in Raventree. No matter the circumstances, I am always happy to see you, little brother." Bran seemed to sigh in relief, as he embraced him back. As they pulled away from each other, Rookie questioned his uncle. "Why aren't you with the army, Uncle Brandon? You are a prince of Winterfell. You should have been at the head of our forces with my brother. You look like a common brigand." Bran laughed awkwardly. "I didn't want to take the chance of being sent back by your father. If I had joined Littlejohn here, Rob would have sent a raven to force me back to Moat Cailin by the time we had reached the Twins. I did the only thing I could think of. I followed the rearguard at a safe distance all the way here from Moat Cailin. You weren't discovered on the causeway?" their brother John the Elder asked him. I have many friends among the Crannog men. They guided me safely through their marches. I didn't have any need to be on the causeway. John seemed impressed with the answer. His youngest son looked apologetic. I apologize, uncle. I never knew that you were out there. Not even Fang noticed your presence. I would have hosted you in my own tent otherwise. Bran laughed. You are a good lad, John. However, I arranged it in such a way that you couldn't have known. I traveled behind the rearguard, while you were with the van. How did you get over the twins? Their brother frowned, clearly reconstructing his journey in his head. Bran grinned. I have never come across a fisherman that isn't willing to lend out his boat for a handful of golden coins. This made him laugh aloud. Most fishermen didn't make a single golden coin in a year, let alone several. Didn't they think you a spy? I mean, look at how you're dressed, uncle. Rookie pointed out. Bran frowned sarcastically. How many enemy spies have direwolves 7 feet tall, nephew? Good point. His eldest son shrugged. I must ask, Bran. How is Moat Cailin faring? Who is in command if something happens? He finally asked. Bethany is in command of the daily running of the moat, its reconstruction and the supply of the large garrison. Lord Flint's brother is in control of all military aspects. He was the commander of the Flint detachment and seems calm and calculated. His younger brother replied truthfully. He accepted the answer. It could have been far worse. His kinsmen all started to talk amongst each other. He looked the situation over and the absurdity of it all. Let us go to the camp. Most of my lords will be worried sick about our sudden disappearance. I wouldn't be surprised if search parties have already been sent out. Besides, I guess my brother and his 2 companions would be glad to be able to wash up. Bran sighed blissfully. I would kill for a bath and some ale. He clasped his hand on his brother's shoulder. We won't let you wait on them any longer. Let's go. They mounted their horses, and Bran and his companions did the same. He suddenly realized that both companions were Crannog men, as he noticed their small stature and ponies. They introduced themselves as Borg Cragmire and Cedric Pete. Both of those were important names among the Crannog men, and he welcomed them heartedly, as he asked after the health of Lord Howland. Bran. He looked upon the face of his only son, who was sitting down bare-chested in one of the comfortable chairs in the room. The room itself seemed to be a courtesy of Lord Blackwood, a thing which he greatly appreciated. He studied his boy. His jawline looked sharper, and he had clearly lost some weight. In contrast, his shoulders and arms seemed to have grown. A small frown could be found upon his forehead, and a large scar upon his upper arm. Nonetheless, his eyes seemed full of life. He didn't seem surprised by his arrival. Of course not, his direwolf shadow had accompanied him here. The direwolf affectionately hugged his master, before he himself grabbed his only son into a bear hug. He would never tell anyone, but a small tear welled up in his eyes at that moment. He had lost his best friend and good brother Alyn, his decade-long protector Sir Benedict and another lifelong friend Lord Miles Mouton, but he still had his son. His son seemed overwhelmed by his show of affection, but he didn't seem to mind. How are you, Bryn? He asked. Better every day, father. The wound on my arm has healed well, and so have my broken ribs. I have recently begun some light training. I get tired easily, but I feel barely any pain. He nodded approvingly. His son would be all right. How are things back at the moat? His son asked in return. He frowned. We must house and control the large 1,000-men garrison. I had them drilled to keep them sharp. On top of that, I had them hunt and build for us. 2 more granaries have been finished, as well as 30 houses in the village and a roof on one of the new towers. Your sisters are well, but they miss you. Your mother has taken the loss of your uncle Alyn badly, but she will get over it in time. She told me to send you her love. His young son took in his words. He looked almost guilty. There was nothing I could do for Uncle Alyn, father. He threw himself into battle with Sir Benedict and some of our personal retinue to protect me. None of them survived, but me. He looked harshly in the 17-year-old boy's eyes. None of that is your fault, Bryn, do you hear me? What Allen did, he did voluntarily. He did it because it was his duty and because he cared for you. He is with the gods now and will be happy that he managed to help save you. Brynden seemed to accept that but was still worried. What will happen to my cousins? He sighed. Since coming north, Allen had had 5 daughters with his wife, a girl coming from the local lower nobility. One of them had died to a sickness last winter, but the other 4 had suddenly come to an uncertain fate. They are well enough. The middle ones spend much time at the moat, in the company of your sisters. The youngest and eldest prefer to stay with their mother but visit often. He started, as he scratched his beard. The betrothal Allen arranged for his eldest daughter Bethany to Sir Morgan Boscage will stand. Sir Morgan accompanied the army south and will have joined our detachment in the camp by now. If he survives this war, they will inherit his lands together. For now, they will be administered by his widow. I will personally find good local marriages for your other 3 cousins. They are nieces to the commander of the moat and Lords Blackwood and Goodwood. I will have no trouble finding them suitors. I will personally arrange their dowries. They will want for nothing. This seemed to set his son's mind at ease. Together they talked about the campaign and what he thought about it. Afterwards, they had dinner with the Blackwood and Goodwood clan. They mourned Allen but enjoyed a pleasant evening. His good brother excused himself profusely about the lack of rooms available and even offered his heir's room to him, but he laughed it off. It had been over a week since he had slept in a bed. He would gladly share his son's room. At night, with Bryn's quiet snoring in the background, he contemplated how lucky he was to be able to see his son's face again. He decided then and there that he wouldn't go to the moat again before this war was over. Bryn needed to be protected, and as his father it was his task to do so. He would see this war out together with his son, for better or for worse. 4 weeks later. Rob. He rode at the head of his army, the familiar gates of stony September looming before him. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cobblestone road, but the warmth of the day still lingered in the air. 2 months ago, he had had to leave this place to the Tyrells. He had done his best then to save the town from destruction and it seemed that they hadn't destroyed it now either. His vanguard had already taken control of it, and their messengers told him that the Reachmen had created a handful of fires when they left, but these had quickly been extinguished by the local populace. He chuckled internally. In their flight south, the Reachmen had even left some of their supplies in the town. Worse than that, they had left over 100 soldiers behind. Those too sick or weak to join them on their forced march to Bitterbridge. His scorched earth tactics had started bearing fruit a month ago, and from the moment that Tyrell pulled back from Lichester his light cavalry hadn't stopped harassing their baggage trains and rear. 2 months the Reachman armies had been in the Riverlands. In that time, no battles had been fought. Nevertheless, the Tyrells had lost 4,000 men and large amounts of weapons and supplies. Some had been lost storming the former neutral castles, but most had died from the attrition by his forces or the lack of supplies. He had lost less than a sixth of that number, most of those being garrisons from houses that had remained neutral during the Civil War. He didn't mind them losing some troops to achieve his objectives. He had already reclaimed all the lost lands and keeps north of here. In the Riverlands, only the Menning and Parrell castles were still in Tyrell hands. Ironically, they were the only ones that were garrisoned. King Garland's message was clear: these lands belong to the Reach. He would have to disappoint him. On the morrow, Bran and Rickon would march to take them. That wasn't the only good news either, as he thought about the messages he had received yesterday evening from the Iron Isles. Lord Harrow's one-arm Harlaw had defeated the Tyrell fleet in a naval battle in the Sunset Sea. It had come at the cost of a fourth of the Ironborn fleet, including one of Lord Harlaw's 5 sons. In response to this, Lord Harrows and his remaining sons were burning the Shield Islands down to ground. They were murdering and pillaging their way through the 4 islands again, apparently even carrying off hundreds of salt wives in the process. That was clever from Lord Harrows. The Iron Islands had been experiencing a demographic disaster for the last 30 years. Bologne's and Euron's war had killed a great part of the able-bodied male population. The Thrall uprising and his destruction of Pike and Saltcliffe had killed even more. The demographic decline had been halted under Lord Roderick and been reversed slowly by his successor Lord Harrows. By importing many fertile women he could speed up that process greatly. It also wasn't technically forbidden under their treaty, which abolished thraldom but didn't abolish the existence of sold wives. He would not object. He had seen what the mighty and noble men from the Reach had done to the people of the Riverlands. Homesteads burned, women raped and people slaughtered. Whether he liked it or not was not the question. His lords, and kin, demanded vengeance paid to them in kind. They openly called for the destruction of the Reach and a campaign that would kill hundreds of thousands of innocents. Denying them this would even shake his rule, and for what? Thousands of zealots from the Reach, both highborn and lowborn, had moved into the Riverlands to plunder and murder. Its septons had supported it, and its merchants had financed it. No, this was a collective responsibility and the punishment would fall upon the whole nation. Tactically, this also made the most sense. This war had shown that the descendants of those punished would come for revenge, and that they would be supported by others from the Reach. Many perceived heirs of the knightly houses he had banished in the region above the Gold Road had joined the Footless during the Civil War. They had hired soldiers from elsewhere in the Reach with money given to them by House Tyrell and others. With those troops they had committed massacres under the Riverlanders in the Menning and Parrel territories. This could never happen again. He would need to ensure that. His first objectives would be securing Tumbleton and the source of the Mandaya. Lord Footley would feel their wrath for what he had done. Tumbleton also housed large numbers of rebels that had fled from the Riverlands. Many of his vassals would love to get revenge on them. From there, they would follow the river until they reached Highgarden. The seat of House Tyrell would not escape his wrath this time. Chapter 92, Revenge in the Reach. 29 AC. Rob. The summer sun shone upon his head, as drops of sweat started to form. No Northman would ever get used to the hotness of a summer day in the Reach. Nonetheless, he felt content. His campaign into his enemy's lands was going well and Tumbleton was nearing the end of its resistance. Courtesy of its forces being largely destroyed at Pink Maiden, and the remnants accompanying King Garland Tyrell throughout the Reach. He had been sieging the town for a week now, while its countryside burned all around it. 40,000 of his soldiers were camped around the town, while 10,000 of his riders burned the North March and the Footley lands to the ground. Hundreds of villages, towns and holdfast were being sacked. Their wealth, harvests and livestock carried off towards the Riverlands in endless streams of wagons bumping northwards. Some of it by the Rosa Road through the Stormlands to Riverport, others by the road to Stony September. Some of the loot was even put on barges and pushed upstream on the Blackwater Rush and the God's Eye River. The regions they were plundering were wealthy, and its harvests seemed astronomically large. The food he would use for three purposes. Firstly, to feed his army on campaign. Secondly, to feed the population of the Riverlands, especially in those areas that were struck the worst by the Civil War and the Tyrell offensive. This way, he could maybe win some of them over to his side once and for all. Thirdly, food would be shipped to Riverrun, Seaguard, Raventree and the north to feed their people and their population booms. This was seen as partial payment for services during the war. The North March and source of the Mandaya regions of the Reach would be methodically stripped of all their valuables. He had tried to control his men and temper their thirst for revenge, but it seemed an impossible task. Half of his Northmen wanted heavy revenge for what happened at Blackwater Bay and the weirwood trees that had been burned. The other half wanted to bathe in the blood of as many Reachmen as they could every night. The Blackwood clan and the Tullys demanded vengeance for the destruction of their lands and the loss or corruption of their kinsmen, while the neutral lords whose lands Tyrell had burned were eager to collect coin and harvests to rebuild their lands. His sons and brothers wanted a show of force as well, even Bran, who was usually cool and collected. The anger of almost losing his only son to Tyrell's scheming rebellion still ran deep. He had managed to frequently stop them from committing the worst atrocities, but he doubted whether the result would be different in the end. In response to all the looting and destruction in the area, even if largely spared up until now, its population would likely die of starvation or be forced to move away. No longer would the lords on his border be powerful and wealthy, strong enough to field armies inside his territories like the Footless. Once he was done with it, the North March would be more desolate than the Gift had been not long ago. He wouldn't stop there. The Reach had done much damage to his kingdom, and he would pay this back exponentially. he would once again gather fortunes like he had done in the Westerlands 30 years ago. Coin that would fuel further development in the north and would provide the means to ensure better defenses and a revival for the Riverlands in the future. Last war, the Reach had lost a significant part of its population but only a small portion of its lands. Ironically, the Tyrells had come out of the war in a better position than they had been coming in. They had pacified the lords of the Reach and had disposed themselves of House Florent, even granting their ancestral lands to one of their own. House Florent hadn't been destroyed though. Lord Alekhine had lost all his male kinsmen, but he himself had managed to escape. After the wars, he had sought refuge with his kinsmen in Storm's End, but they had kindly refused him. Queen Shireen hadn't wanted to anger the Reach, and the Storm Lords felt great resentment towards her maternal kin for their part in Stannis' defeat. Lord Alekhine had died as a bitter old man in Pentos, but not before fathering 3 sons on the daughter of one of his household knights that he had hurriedly married when she had fallen pregnant the first time. The oldest of these sons, Ryam, had suddenly arrived in his camp 3 days ago. The 19-year-old had brought with him 200 Isozi sellswords, a sizable war chest and a hatred of all things Tyrell that seemed to resonate from his skin. His younger brothers remained in Pentos to ensure the family's survival, but he had come with one mission, to destroy House Tyrell and reclaim Brightwater Keep. He had gladly accepted the man into his service, as he gave him the perfect plan and justification to weaken House Tyrell for good. Ryam's large monetary gifts to fund his campaign also helped. Whatever the case, he would first have to capture this town whose flags were still fluttering proudly in the soft summer breeze. Its walls were strong, its storage filled to the brim and its walls manned. The latter was mostly done by untrained townsmen and farmers that had fled inside the walls, as its main forces were largely destroyed and its remnants were with the main Reachman army. His soldiers would surely be able to take it by force. Nonetheless, a stone thrown by an unarmored farmer could be as deadly from that height as an arrow from a trained marksman. To limit casualties, he had been properly preparing the assault for a week now. Ladders had been constructed, grappling hooks assembled and weaknesses in the defense had been scouted. 2 days ago, Lady Footley had insulted him by offering to pay off the siege. As if a modest sum of money could buy off the fact that Tumbleton was housing hundreds of Riverlanders fleeing for the consequences of their rebellion. Let alone that it would smoothen relations with him after House Footless' role and the presence of Lady Footless' pregnant daughter, Elmar's former wife, within the walls. No, Tumbleton would be made an example of. Hopefully his show of strength here would temper his vassals in their search for vengeance in the future. He looked over the lines of his soldiers, as he brushed the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. A northern sergeant looked expectingly at him, and after taking a few breaths he finally nodded. The sergeant shouted his orders and the sound of northern war horns filled the valley. Almost instantly, his army started to move. In front of him, his son Ricard assailed the walls together with Stark, Umber and Sewin men. On the north side, the town's best defended side, the forces of Houses Vance and Leicester charged. This was the group expected to have the highest casualties, as such they were made up of those who had previously kept neutral. On the south side, Hoster Tully attacked with Bracken and Malister men. Lastly, on the east side, Ryam Florent and his mercenaries attacked together with the Skagasi and clansmen under his brother John. He wore his battle armor, the running direwolf emblazoned on his chest, but today he would not enter the fray. His lords had insisted that he stayed back, to oversee and command, but the distance gnawed at him. His son had taken up the direct leadership of House Stark's men and protected its honor, yet it still burdened him. Nonetheless, his vassals were right. A stray arrow could end his life and without him this army and its alliances would fall apart. He couldn't risk it for a tactically irrelevant town as Tumbleton. True as this may be, he expected other motives were also in play. His men didn't want to be held back from taking their revenge anymore, not when the subject of their wrath was the seat of House Footley. Deep inside he knew this, yet he had relented anyway. If he wanted to remain in control of his army, he couldn't stand in their way now. Besides, Ricard was leading the forces now. His gaining experience and the respect of his vassals was not something he could object to. He watched as his soldiers raised the ladders against the walls. Battering rams, their iron heads glinting, pounded relentlessly against the massive wooden gates of the town. The rhythmic thud echoed across the plain, a steady drumbeat of impending doom. He looked on as he saw the defenders desperately trying to counter them with burning water and flaming arrows. However, they had preemptively covered them with dampened hides to repel those. Crossbowmen and archers lined the ramparts of the town, loosing volley after volley of arrows into the advancing troops. He saw some men fall, their bodies crumbling lifelessly to the ground, but the assault did not falter. Rallying cries were heard in front of him, and soon he could see the first of his men reaching the top of the walls. Not much later, parts of the enemy archer fire stopped as his soldiers engaged their archers in close combat on top of the walls. "How long until the walls fall?" Galbart asked, the voice of his grandson betraying how overwhelmed the young boy was feeling. "Not long now," he replied, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. "The breaches on top of the walls are widening. The barrages of arrows are lessening, which gives our men on the ground pause. Once the gates are down, our men will flood the streets." His squire nodded, his young eyes wide as he concentrated on every little fight in front of him. Slowly time passed on the hill on the west side of the town from upon which they were watching. He saw more and more of his soldiers pour onto the walls, its fighting getting closer to the towers. After a while, one of the footly banners unceremoniously fell down from the tower wall it was hanging. A clear sight that his men were inside. The sounds of death cries, metal and commands was largely drowned out by the rhythmic echoes of the battering rams. As the sun passed its highest point, a resounding crash echoed through the valley. The gates of Tumbleton finally gave way. With a roar, his troops surged forward, pouring through the breach like a tide unleashed. Similar sounds were heard from further away, on the other sides of the town. He watched, a silent sentinel on the hill, as his direwolf banner was raised over the gatehouse. The town had fallen, yet it seemed that not all defenders had already realized this. The sound of fighting was still heard, although it seemed to get further and further away as time passed. A second wave of reserves charged through the western gate, under the leadership of Lord Goran Glover. His grandson looked proudly as his father rode inside the town at the head of 500 riders and 1,000 more foot soldiers. "Can we go inside, grandfather?" Galbart asked him. He shook his head. Not yet, but soon. He knew this to be the most dangerous part of the capture of a town. Its defenders were fleeing. Some would have hidden inside of the houses or granaries. Once they saw his royal standard, the bold and bitter would come out to try and gain eternal glory by slaying him in the streets with a hidden projectile. He would not risk his grandson's life in such a manner. On top of that, there would be scenes he didn't want his grandson to see. The Footless had done too much damage to his lands and vassals. He couldn't have convinced them not to sack the town if he had tried. When his son Ricard and his friends had openly called for the utter destruction of Tumbleton, he had known what would happen when he gave him operational command. He had no intention to be a part of that. His grandson was too young for the horrors that would be taking place behind those walls at this very moment. It would be bad enough when he saw the aftermath. Silently, he watched on as more men poured onto the walls and the sounds of violence died down. After a while, a lone rider rode out of the gatehouse towards his position. He wore the colors of House Sewin and bowed his head before talking to him. "Your Grace, the Crown Prince has sent me to inform you that the keep has fallen." Our soldiers followed some rooting peasants inside and managed to get control of the gate. After that, it was child's play. The town and keep are being cleared as we speak, but your royal entrance will be secure. "Thank you," he told the soldier. "Give this man some wine and let him rest if he wants to." He called out to one of his sergeants. "We prepare to march inside." He then shouted to the rest of the group. 100 Winterfell soldiers snapped to attention, as he mounted his horse. With To and Galbart next to him, he rode through the gates of Tumbleton. Half-mangled and bled-out corpses from both sides were scattered along the gate, but that was nothing in comparison to what awaited him. He took the main road from the gate towards the keep, and the bodies of slaughtered civilians lay alongside those of defenders. As they passed an alley, he saw a soldier carrying a naked, screaming woman on his shoulder. The wailing of multiple women could be heard from inside the buildings they passed, as recently orphaned children cried alongside the roads trying to wake their dead fathers from their eternal slumber. The situation didn't sit well with him, but he knew this would happen. Most of the perpetrators of Southhorn had fled here, and many sons and husbands of these women had happily murdered and raped inside the Riverlands just months ago. His army would have never accepted lenient terms for this town. It had to be destroyed in the most brutal of ways. He had always known that. The further they got along the road, the fewer defenders and the more civilian bodies they saw. Only the children seemed to have been spared somewhat, a courtesy those reachmen hadn't given to the children of the Riverlands. Still, occasional smaller bodies were found amidst the slaughter as well. 3 times looting bands of soldiers passed them. They always bowed to him, before scurrying away in their search for more loot. He hated Garland Tyrell for forcing him to do this. In his mind, he knew well enough that this was only the beginning. Even after destroying every village, hamlet and town 50 leagues south of the border and making the borderlands unlivable, the Reach would not stop. Tyrell still commanded well over 50,000 men, and he wasn't giving up. He had raged when he had heard about the Battle of the Blueburn. A few weeks ago, Garland Tyrell had divided his army after reaching Bitterbridge. 20,000 men under Lords Redwine, Hightower, Rowan, Crane and Oakert had moved west to confront the Lannisters, while he had taken the remaining 35,000 men and force-marched them south. He had surprised the Stormlanders on the banks of the Blueburn River. The Baratheons, having split their army, were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Garland had defeated King Consort Edric, killing and capturing over 5,000 of his men. Edric and his son Stannis had survived, but many important nobles had been taken captive. The main Baratheon force had retreated back to the border with the Stormlands, allowing Garland to score additional victories by recapturing the lost towns and castles along the Blueburn. He had planned to link up his forces with Edric now that the Royces had arrived in Riverport. However, that plan needed to be reconsidered now. All of this went through his head, in an attempt to block out the horrors around him. When they finally reached the castle, he was greeted by Meager Sewin and a handful of nobles from the mountain clans. He greeted Arya's son warmly, and the Sewin heir brought him inside to the Great Hall. There he found his eldest son talking with Hoster Tully, in front of the highest-ranking noble captives taken today. The women and children cried fearfully at the sight of him entering the hall. The few men, all greybeards, looked resigned. He embraced Rookie, his cousin, and some of his nephews. "Can you introduce me, son?" he asked his heir. Ricard smiled. "Of course, father." He stretched out his arms, nonchalantly pointing at the people he was naming. "This is Lord Footless Uncle. Next to him stand the elder cousins of Lord Rollingford, the local Maester, Septon and Man-at-Arms. The latter is a distant relative of the Footless as well." He started. "This is Lady Footley with her 2 widowed daughters and her 3 grandchildren. This is her good sister, with her own daughter and goddaughter and her 2 grandchildren. Behind them stands the Rollingford family. Lady Rollingford, her 3 daughters and her youngest son on the left, and the wives of Lord Rollingford's brothers on the right with their children. The elder lady is Lord Rollingford's mother." He looked them all over. These were the wives and children of the men responsible for the rape and murder of Lion Castle, and that of her children. He had personally received a letter from her mother Jonelle demanding vengeance in her name. Jonelle's brother Clee, his Sewin nephews and Rookon had received similar letters. These Rollingfords were also responsible for the deaths of John Slate and 6 of his 7 children and thousands of others. "I think you left someone out," he remarked, and his son nodded. Nonetheless, it was not Ricard but Hoster who replied. Grinding his teeth, the Lord of Riverrun stepped forward. "This here is Eleanor Tully, Elmar's former wife." He scoffed, clearly having difficulty with naming her a Tully. Eleanor had brown chestnut hair. She looked rather plain but had a haughty demeanor, nonetheless. She was unmistakably pregnant, if he had to guess she was some 5 months along. "Greetings to you all," he politely commented to all of them. This wasn't to their liking. "How can you stand there like that when your men are butchering the city?" Lady Footley shouted. "How can you stand there after what you did to my sons and my husband's nephews?" He looked her calmly in the eyes, but inside him cold anger threatened to boil over. How dare she have the audacity to accuse him of starting this useless circle of bloodshed? "What my men are doing in your town is nothing compared to what your men did in the Riverlands. Tumbleton's population is around 15,000 people. At least 40 times that amount of people lost their lives in the Riverlands to your soldiers and their allies. Have you heard the reports of what your guests here did to my people? Women were raped by the hundreds in the blood of their murdered children. Babies were pulled from their cribs and thrown out of windows. Men were shackled in weirwood trees and then burned alive together with their holy sites. He then looked over the other women of House Folly. Your sons died while invading my lands, butchering my people and destroying my religion's holy places. You are lucky that I don't throw you on the streets to join in the fate you chose for your people. After today, Tumbleton will be no more. I will have its buildings burned to the ground and its walls pulled down. Tumbleton will serve as a reminder why you don't cross me or my kingdom ever again. He saw the shock and anger take hold in the eyes of the women and elderly in front of him. Besides, you dare to accuse me of the fate of your nephew. Your nephew tried to kill the only son of my brother Brandon. He nearly succeeded, if not for my other brother Rickon. His direwolf feasted upon your nephew's corpse that night after he had mauled him to death. The older woman behind Lady Folly and the two younger women next to her started crying uncontrollably. They were the nephew's mother, wife and sister, if he had to guess. Lady Folly just looked at him with undisguised hatred. As if that wasn't enough, we could point out your treatment of houses Manning and Parrell. Rookie interjected. He looked questioningly at his eldest son, who explained himself. We found them in the dungeons, or what's left of them. They killed all adult males when taking the castles. They captured all the women and children, even those from the female lines that they could find, and brought them over here. In total from both families, 21 people were captured. All of them were either descendants of Lords Harry Parrell or Corliss Manning, or Lord Corliss' two nieces, or their spouses. Only 12 of them survived captivity. Coincidentally, his heir emphasized the word sarcastically, all male descendants from both the male and female lines of Lord Parrell died in captivity. Only one male line grandson from Lord Manning is alive, but he is sick. A month longer and he too would have died. Luckily, the Maester tells me that the boy will live. You deserve to be thrown out there. If it were up to me, I would do it. Luckily for you, my father won't allow it. Pray on your knees to your gods for his existence, as he is the only one ensuring you a fair trial. The fates of houses Manning and Parrell angered him to his core. Lord Corliss had been a loyal vassal, and before that a trusted guard. He had done a lot to help achieve his vision from the Riverlands and had proven a capable vassal in the southern Riverlands. Lord Parrell had been a trusted counsellor of Edmure and Hoster. After hearing what happened to their descendants, even he was tempted to have them all drowned in the Mandaya. He had to keep his cool, and for that to happen they needed to get out of his sight. He looked to a handful of Tully soldiers who were standing in the back of the hall. You, accompany the women and children to one of the servants' quarters. Get the servants out of there and lock them inside. Bring them water and food when that is done, but keep a permanent guard. Your Mallister companions may guide the men towards the cells. King Stark, I implore you to show mercy. I am but a humble Septon. I serve the gods, nothing more. The old Septon tried to negotiate his freedom. He stepped forward, until he was right in front of the Septon. You only serve your gods. Did your gods tell you to advise Lord Folly to behead the old gods believing elderly that had remained on the Goodwood and Tully lands after we had retreated for the Tyrell army? Did they advise Footliss' youngest son during the civil war to burn away a wood tree and have his men chant religious songs around it to celebrate? He looked hard into the eyes of the elderly man. I have nothing against your gods, they are the gods of my mother after all. I do have something against certain wrong interpretations made by some of their followers wishing to use your religion to expand their power and influence. I have executed many a Septon in the Riverlands who had been trialed and convicted for doing such a thing. You will face trial with the rest of the men and face the consequences of your actions. He nodded to a Mallister guardsman to take him with him. The Septon started whining, but he paid him no mind. He looked around at his lords and vassals. We will burn down this God's forsaken keep to ground. He told them. Loot everything beforehand and bring it back to the camp so it can be transported northwards to Riverport. By nightfall, we burn it all down. 10 days later. Ricard. He was standing in his tent overlooking the maps of the Reach spread out on the table in front of him. He had seen his father do this all throughout his childhood and it had always fascinated him. It seemed that he had now picked up his father's habit. They found themselves 100 miles southwest of Tumbleton on the north side of the Mandaya. His father had ordered the army, except for scouts and outriders, to remain on the north side. He knew that he feared an attack from the main Tyrell host, as they didn't know its exact location. After splitting his force, Garland Tyrell had defeated Edric Baratheon and forced him to retreat back towards the Stormlands. A smaller Stormlander force of around 10,000 men had still found itself in the Reach under Edric Robert. Robert Baratheon had managed to sack Ashford, the only place where his famous grandfather and namesake had ever lost a battle, before also retreating to his homeland to unite his forces with those of his father. This gave breathing room to Tyrell, not something they had wanted to give him. King Garland had taken control of the situation and was retaking his lost lands in quick succession. Nonetheless, the damage had been great. The Baratheon campaign would greatly weaken the kingdom in the future, and the Stormlanders weren't out of the fighting yet. His father had written them many letters, promising them supplies and logistical support if they launched another incursion into the Reach after reforming their armies. The situation was now tense. They only knew that Tyrell was somewhere between Ashford and Bitterbridge, a huge area which would cost dozens of days to traverse with his army of at least 30,000 men. This meant that the Reach forces could only be a few days away, or they could be weeks away. Their outriders had found nothing as far south as Bitterbridge and they knew that the other army found itself on the south side of the Mandaya. That was the reason that they had chosen to avoid the Rosa Road, even if it would have made their march quicker and supply situation easier. Their main objective was Bitterbridge, which was only some 50 miles away from them by now. By securing that castle, they would deny Tyrell his supply point in the north and effectively destroy any hopes of him returning to the Riverlands. They would also secure the most important crossing over the Mandaya this far north. His father seemed on edge and had sent dozens of outriders to the southern bank of the river. They were ordered to scout as far as the Blueburn River to locate the enemy and ensure their army's safety. The Tyrell host hadn't been the only thing that made his father nervous. News continued to trickle in from the west, and not all of it was good. Lord Hobber Redwine had routed a force of 8,000 Westerlanders under Sir Martin Lannister east of Old Oak, which had resulted in the death of the Lannister king's twin brother. King Willem had taken Red Lake and had planned to move on Golden Grove next, but these plans would now be discarded. His army remained at the seat of House Crane. When they had discussed this, his uncles had told him that they believed that he would stay there to reform his army before moving further into the Reach. This created a situation where the Reach had managed to stabilize the land war on all fronts except their own. The Baratheons had been thrown back and the Lannisters halted in their tracks. Luckily, they weren't the only allies they had been able to call in. The Ironborn had by now taken control of all the Shield Islands and had turned them into forward operating bases for their navy. Reports came in that they were raiding the western coast from Old Oak all the way down to Bunderlyn. In a huge frontal assault, they had managed to take one of the new forts at the mouth of the Mandaya. If they managed to take the other one, the expensive and elaborate defenses that Willers Tyrell had built would all be for naught and raiders would once again freely sail upstream on the Mandaya. Willers' son Garland had emptied the forts of over half their defenders to bolster his forces when invading the Riverlands. This had given the Iron Islands a unique opportunity, one which Lord Harris Harlaw seemed keen on taking. For now, the second fort had beaten back his assaults, but without help it wouldn't survive for much longer. This would at least continue to serve as a serious distraction for the men of the Reach. For now, they continued on with their own strategy. They were methodically raiding the North March. Everything of value was being taken, while fortifications and walled towns were demolished. His father, on the insistence of many of their lords, had decreed that a 150-mile-long demilitarized zone would span south from their border, namely the Gold Road or Blackwater. In this area, no walled population centers or castles would remain. He himself, with the backing of many powerful lords like Carstark, Umber, Ryswell, Tully and Blackwood, was pushing to extend that zone ever further. This served threefold. Firstly, it would cripple the Reach and make it impossible for the Tyrells to ever stage a campaign into the Riverlands again, as their logistical situation would never allow it. Secondly, it would satisfy their need for revenge and spoils. Thirdly, it would render them incapable of ever resisting a second campaign into the Reach. Whenever the Southern Kingdom angered the North in the future, raiding incursions could be launched without impunity. This would forever put them in a weak diplomatic position. The more spoils they got from this operation, the larger the projects they could afterwards achieve. His father's reign had been financed by Lannister gold. If he wanted his own future reign to be as successful, he would need coin and food. The Reach had both in abundance. Already over 15,000 livestock had been herded into the riverlands, with hundreds of tons of grains, fruits and vegetables being carted behind them. Its rich villages and towns had been diligently stripped of their wealth and resources, with the recent sack of Tumbleton being their crowning achievement. He knew that his father and some of the riverlords had been disgusted by the brutal scenes there, but his father was too clever to oppose the will of the lords on this. Most of the riverlords were easy to convince with the sight of hundreds of carts of loot leaving on the Rosa Road towards Riverport. Uncle Rukan, who had just rejoined the main force, had burned the area between the Blackwater, the Stormlands and Tumbleton and ensured the protection of those carts. The local border lords, namely Houses Sumber, Rosby, Hayford and Mossbridge, had eagerly joined him in this endeavour. This had managed to satiate their thirst for revenge, and in this, they had been joined by Houses Carstark and Slate. Uncle Brandon and his cousin Bryndon were still burning the North March with a force of 3,000 men consisting of the Cranogmen, the Blackwood clan and House Mouton, with the addition of the detachment from Moat Cailin. His little brother John was roaming another part of the North March with the forces of Houses Dustin, Tallheart and Mormont. Streams of thousands of refugees fled in front of them towards Bitterbridge and Highgarden, but he would not have it any other way. Let Highgarden know what was coming. It would also keep them busy, as they would need to feed those people and keep them pacified, which would drain resources they desperately needed for their war effort. He looked over one of his detailed maps of the North March with his quill in his hand. He had forced the Maester of Tumbleton to copy it for him, so now he could scratch out the names of all villages and towns that had already been sacked. Since then, he did this every time new reports came in from his brother or uncle. While striking through the name of a village called Pig's Ditch, someone walked into his tent. He looked up, surprised to see his father standing there alone, with only Grey Wind next to him. His jaw looked tense, and lines of worry were etched upon his forehead. He immediately put down the quill. "What is it, father?" "News has come from Winterfell," he replied, clearly with a heavy heart. An icy cold took hold of him. "My children. Did something happen?" He immediately stumbled out. Rob shook his head. "No, your family is well regarded. It concerns Lysa." Although the first sentence calmed him, the last one made his eyes grow wide. Lysa was his younger brother's young wife. Although the marriage was arranged, the two had quickly fallen in love. She was pregnant with John's first child too. His father looked at him with a pained look. "She has died in childbirth. The midwives and Maester did all they could, but she bled out regardless." He took in the news. This would devastate his young brother. "What about the child?" he asked fearfully. "A son. They managed to save him, at least. Her last wish was to call him Artos, after her ancestor Artos the Implacable. Your mother specifically mentions in her letter that the name is meant to symbolize the reconciliation between his line and those of his brothers William and Roderick, whom House Stark both descends from." His father explained. "A good name," he voiced. "Hopefully this Artos will be as close and useful to the reign of my son Edwyle as the old Artos was for our ancestor and his nephew, with the same name." His father nodded approvingly. "John will not take the news well. No, he has been anxious about her health and that of the child ever since he left Winterfell. This will come as a devastating blow to him." He agreed sadly. "How do we break the news to him? Do we wait until he returns?" his father asked him. He sighed. "John is with Lysa's brothers in the North March now. The chance is that Lord Roderick will have sent word to them himself. I think that this is too big a news to hide from him. Besides, it might be a good thing if he receives the news now." His father frowned. "How so?" He sighed. "It gives him a way to get the anger, pain and resentment out of his mind. Let him rave a bit in the North March." His father's jaw tightened. You mean to let him terrorize the local populace? To commit massacres in her name? He shrugged. He knew that he and his father had completely different views on the use of terror tactics and the treatment of the local small folk. Father, do you deny that John will be screaming and raving when he hears this news? The king in the north shook his head. I know it better than you, rookie. I will never forget the moment that I received the news about my father's death while leading the Northern Army to Riverrun. I know the pain of losing someone you love better than I hope you ever will. He nodded. And both me and my brother are very much like you. Nonetheless, you can't deny that we have more of the wolf's blood in us than you do. His father agreed with a scoff. Especially you, my boy. It still surprises me to this day. Although it has to be said that you have learned well to keep it in check at times, and I find it clouds your judgment much less than when you were younger. He nodded. The rashness he had had in his youth had disappeared. Ironically, it was the advice of his wilder uncles that had helped with that, not that of his father. Uncle Rukon, but also Uncles Harry and To, had told him to keep it in and to only let it out in times that were opportune. Uncle Harry had told him that his wild anger could be a force to be reckoned with, but only if he knew when to let it out and when to hold it in. It was this he was trying to tell his father. John is more like me in this. He will need an outlet for his anger, sooner or later. I would rather have him murder a few hundred peasants who will die of starvation anyway, than have him charge headfirst into battle like a berserker only for me to lose my younger brother. He explained his reasoning. I was thinking of recalling him, so he wouldn't do anything stupid. His father countered. No, you can't do that. He responded firmly. He will see it as a slight. He will think that you see him as a little princeling that needs coddling when life hits. This feeling, and the feelings of loss, anger and resentment he will feel about the loss of his wife, will make him careless. He needs an outlet for his feelings, and he needs it quickly. You would have the people of the North March bear his anger? His father asked him. I would trade 1,000,000 millers and farmers from the Reach if it meant keeping my brother safe in future battles. It is my job, as the eldest son, to take care of my siblings, father. That is what you thought me. Let me do that. Trust me on this. Tell him that he can come back to the army if he needs the pack, but that he can continue raiding the North March if he feels his task isn't done. He will come to us when he is ready. He replied. He can get hurt in the North March too. His father voiced, clearly unsure on what to do. Father, we are at war. He can get hurt at any time. Nonetheless, I would prefer his odds now. He has thousands of armed and trained riders against a handful of farmers with pitchforks or a knightly house in a tower with a dozen retainers. Soon, we will be storming Bitterbridge and other well-fortified castles. We might be fighting large, pitched battles like Pink Maiden again against Tyrell. The result of him doing something stupid out of grief there will be exponential compared to him doing something now. His father looked at him. His clear blue eyes looked dull and tired. They locked eyes for a little while, before he nodded. I will send the letter on to your brother. He walked over to his father, grabbing him in a bear hug. You are doing the right thing, father. For him, for the pack and for the North. Soon, this war will be over, and we will be able to return to Winterfell. His father chuckled at that, but his eyes didn't join in his laughter. That's what I thought during the last wars. It took years for me to get home to your mother and sister. The war will take how long it must take. Nonetheless, we will see it to an end. He knew that their treatment of the local populace was taking a toll on his father. Two things especially bothered him. Firstly, the fate of Eleanor Tully, Elmar's late wife. She had been killed, and understandably so. She had been pregnant and had been telling everyone that her future son would avenge both sides of his family and destroy Ho's line. Officially, a footman that had lost almost his entire family to Elmar's forces in the Civil War had eliminated her, but his father and many others suspected Hoster. Even if Hose had had a hand in it, could anyone blame him? Nevertheless, the thought of killing the unborn child inside of her hadn't sat well with his father. He saw it as a kind of kinslaying, even though no one had had a way of knowing for certain if he had done it. What was sure is that he would watch Oscar's children's progress in Riverrun with eagle eyes in the future. The second thing that weighted heavily on his father's mind was what had happened at Tumbleton. Why his father cared so much about these enemy peasants, he would never know or understand. Their own people, yes, but not these southern flowers. These people were the ones that had helped Elmar to rebel. These men had joined his army, fletched his arrows and provided his provisions. He had no mercy for them, but it seemed his father did. Maybe he was a better man than he was, or maybe Osric was right about his father. His friend and good brother had told him a few weeks ago that the reason why his father was so good at warfare was that he wasn't made for it. He was the greatest general the North had seen in hundreds of years, but he didn't enjoy any of it. While fighting or commanding, all his father thought about was how to get home as quickly and efficiently as possible. To get home, he needed to get an edge on their opponent, and that is what he was after, almost obsessively. Every soldier or peasant that he had to kill to achieve this pained him, although he would never hesitate to do so if it was necessary for the war effort. His father was a great man, an even better king and the best army commander he had ever seen. Nevertheless, Osric's words could ring true. Maybe he wasn't made for war. Maybe he just excelled at it, without always having the stomach for it. All the while, his father hugged him back in the privacy of his tent. When he finally let him go, his father looked over the maps on his table. "What villages have been hit now?" he asked him, and he pointed out the latest areas raided by their forces in response. Afterwards, he poured 2 glasses of wine from a nearby pitcher. His father seemed deep in thought. "Those areas are almost completely covered by our raiders. Soon, our men will have to move more south or west." The king in the north voiced his thoughts aloud. Gone was the vulnerable father. In front of him was the man who had ended kingdoms and houses spanning back to the age of heroes. When you looked at him, with the streaks of grey hair coming through his red curls, you could see why their men revered him. This was the man that forced Umbers, Boltons and Scaddacy to do his bidding with the single movement of an eyebrow. Many epithets he had been given: Lannister's Bane, the Golden Company's Ruin, the Last Dragon Slayer, Greyjoy's Doom, or the more recent Faith's Terror. However, as he looked now, hunched over his maps with his face an icy cold mask absently scratching grey wind next to him, the Wolf King seemed to cover it all. They had their disagreements, now more than ever, but there was no man he trusted more than the father who stood in front of him. He dreaded the moment he would have to fill his large boots, but cherished all the wisdom he could learn from him until then. In the end, he simply walked back to his side to discuss the state of the war. Chapter 93, Bitterbridge. 29f. Bran. The dawn sky was a deep crimson, as if the gods themselves had bled into the horizon. It prophesied to all what kind of day it would be, a day of blood and battle. Bitterbridge loomed ahead, the small castle standing defiantly against the northern host. His target was the eastern wall, the castle's weakest point, and he was determined to take it as quickly as he could. Robb had given him 1,500 men to finish the job, and he would not fail him. The air was thick with tension, the distant cries of ravens mingling with the murmurs of his soldiers, Northmen who had marched from the lands around Moat Cailin, hardened by a life close to the swamps of the Neck, and reinforced by archers and footmen from House Blackwood. He was clad in darkened steel armor emblazoned with a silver direwolf and stood at the head of his forces himself. A bit further to the left stood his son Brynden. The boy had fully healed from his injuries, and only the scars he carried betrayed his close encounter with death. His son's face was grim, his eyes sharp as steel. He was no longer a boy, but a man grown, his legs strong beneath him as he prepared to lead men into battle. To his right prowled Shadow, his son's charcoal-colored direwolf. Shadow's father, his own direwolf Summer, flanked his boy's other side. Summer would accompany his son's assault against the gate, as he would have no use of him whilst scaling the walls. His companion knew that keeping Bryn alive was more important than anything else. He himself would scale the ladders on the right side of the eastern wall, while Sir Edmund Blackwood would attack the other side. His older good brother had become a constant companion of him after Alin's dead, and when Edmund couldn't be found with him personally, he could either be found with his brothers, Bryn or Rickon. Suddenly, a war horn sounded its low, mournful note echoing across the battlefield. He raised his hand, signaling his archers forward. The men of House Blackwood moved swiftly. In moments, the first volley was loosed, darkening the sky as hundreds of arrows arced toward the eastern wall. The defenders atop the wall shouted in alarm, shields raised to block the deadly rain. Bitterbridge was a small castle, but the Tyrell king had strengthened it, and it was very well garrisoned. Dozens of heads were visible atop the stone and wooden walls. A handful of them dying from the arrow fire down below. After a while, he turned to his men. To the walls, he shouted, his words easily carrying over the first sounds of battle. His soldiers surged forward, a tide of iron and leather, their war cries fierce and familiar. He himself led the charge, his sword unsheathed in his hands. "Bring the ladders," he commanded, after taking shelter directly under the walls. The northern soldiers rushed forward, heaving tall wooden ladders into position against the fortification. Bran took hold of one himself, his grip firm on the rough wood. "With me," he shouted, rallying his men around him. With a determined roar, he led the charge, driving the ladder into the wall and beginning the climb himself. His soldiers followed, scaling the walls with grim determination. He had put away his sword, now carrying his shield over his head as he slowly climbed up. Heavy stones and other projectiles ricochet off it, straining his arm, but he could not let it down. Lowering his shield now meant certain death. At the same time, arrows whistled past him, striking men down below, their cries accompanying him up step by step. The climb was harrowing, each run a struggle against the rain of arrows and the boiling water that the defenders poured down upon them. Luckily, he managed to evade or block it all. Not all were so lucky. Some of his men screamed as they fell, their bodies crashing to the ground below. As he neared the top, a defender appeared above him, a spear thrusting down toward his face. He immediately twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding its deadly point, and with a swift motion, thrust his metal shield against the side of the enemy spear. He caught it between his shield and the wall. The wooden shaft broke in two, its iron tip falling down to the ground. In a big final effort, he thrashed his shield around wildly to get the defender away from the battlements. His gamble worked, giving him just enough time to jump atop the parapet. Immediately, 3 attackers stormed him. Unable to draw his sword, he blocked their sword and axes until the man behind him managed to join him atop the walls. The grizzled Northman charged 2 of the defenders with his axe, giving him just enough time to unsheath his sword. He slashed back against his opponent, pushing him far away from the ladder. He traded blows with the axeman, both unable to deal a decisive blow. However, he didn't need to deal a decisive blow. He just needed to buy time for more of his men to scale the walls. His men poured over the battlements, either from behind him or from the ladders next to him, and the battle atop the walls turned fierce and chaotic. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew their lives hung in the balance. It was a brutal, grinding fight, the clash of steel on steel deafening in the confined space. He stood side by side with his men, as they tried to establish a shield wall in the cleared space on the wall they had captured. Unable to attack much, he shielded his comrades in arms as much as possible. After a while, a few dozen of his men had ascended the walls. Now was the time to make their move. "Men, we push!" he shouted. "Push, push, push!" he screamed continuously, in a rhythm emphasized by the movement of their shields. Swords and spears clashed against them, as the soldier to his right fell. However, his place was quickly taken in by another. Slowly but surely, they pushed the enemy back and cleared as much territory as they could. "On 3, we break apart!" he screamed again. 3, 2, 1. "Now!" he shouted, as he pushed his direct opponent back, slashing his sword in a high feint before going for his leg and cutting the man's femoral artery. The next defender lunged at him with an axe, but he sidestepped the blow, bringing his sword up with an underhand swing to slice through the man's throat. Blood sprayed across the stones, and the man crumpled to the ground. His last cries incomprehensible, as blood spat up through his mouth and nose. But for every man he and his soldiers felled, more seemed to take their place as new defenders ran out from the towers. Still, they managed to cut them back down. Bit by bit, they united the last isolated pockets of their soldiers up the wall. From below, enemy archers from inside the courtyard shot at their men, but they brought their own archers up who shot back at them from inside their established areas on top of the walls. He could see the fatigue in his men's eyes, the strain of the fight beginning to wear on them. "Rotate! Men from the back push forward!" he shouted, as they now had enough men to start rotating soldiers piecemeal. Push them back. He yelled once more, rallying his men. We will take this wall, or we will die upon it. His words steeled their resolve, and with a unified roar, the northern soldiers pressed forward, forcing the defenders back step by bloody step. Most of the time, he fought at the front, his sword arm tirelessly at work to reach his aim. As the battle raged on, the parapet got slick with blood, while the air thickened with the stench of the dead. After a long gruesome battle, the enemy ran towards the towers and blockaded the wooden doors. 7 reachmen were left behind on the battlements with them, and they all quickly surrendered, knowing full well that resistance would simply result in their deaths. The enemy tried to block them from getting down into the courtyard, but they wouldn't hinder them for long. Already 3 enormous northern fighters were hacking at the door with their axes. It wouldn't be long before the wooden door fell under their swings. In the meantime, his archers shot into the courtyard below, exchanging fire with the enemy archers. He saw archers getting shot down in the courtyard, as men were screamingly shot down from the walls around him. Personally, he stayed away from that side of the wall. His family had no use for him dead. A loud noise was heard then, and the gates flew open. His son's men surged forward, pouring through the breach like a tide of iron and steel. In front of them Summer and Shadow charged. The great direwolves leaping over the remnants of the wooden beams, their teeth bared in a savage snarl as they started pushing aside the enemy soldiers and breaking up their formation. A few moments later, another great crack was heard and Umbermen started flooding through the second gate on the opposite side. He looked around and he saw the soldiers of House Vance fighting hard on the battlements on the northern side, while Dustins and Flints had secured most of the southern wall. He didn't have much time to survey the battle, as they broke through the tower door at that exact moment. He turned around and joined his men in assaulting the structure. To his surprise, it was nearly empty, as only 4 men had stayed behind to defend it. Those 4 had already been swatted aside by the time he arrived, their blood painting the inner walls of the tower red. Together with his soldiers, he rushed down and they burst into the courtyard, where the defenders were scrambling to regroup as they were assailed from all sides. He knew they would need to press the attack quickly, before the enemy could rally. Forward! He commanded, his voice hoarse but resolute. The fight in the courtyard was no less brutal than the one atop the walls. After a short time, the defenders, outnumbered and demoralized, began to break, fleeing toward the keep in a desperate bid for safety. As the last of the resistance crumbled, he stood in the center of the courtyard, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his sword still clutched in his hand. Summer came up beside him, panting heavily, his fur matted with blood. Umbermen had followed the fleeing defenders into the keep, and now men from all sides were joining them. It didn't take long after that before the message came which they had all been hoping for. Bitterbridge was theirs. The entrance to the keep had fallen, and with it, the last of the defenders' will to fight. He turned to his men, raising his sword high. The fortress is ours. He shouted, his voice ringing out over the battlefield. For the north. A cheer rose from the northern soldiers, their voices echoing off the stone walls. For Raventree. Sir Edmund shouted, which also resonated across the courtyard, soon followed by similar chants about the Riverlands, Last Hearth, Barrowton and others. Shadow trotted over to him, and he scratched his son's direwolf behind the ear as Bryn walked over. He looked his boy over, making sure that he didn't have any serious wounds. When satisfied, he grabbed him in a hug and together they celebrated their victory. Not much later, Rob rode inside with Ricard. His brother and nephew were wearing their crowns, and their direwolves flanked them. It was quite a sight, and the effect on the soldiers was immediately noticeable. Bitterbridge has fallen. His elder brother shouted, and their men cheered and shouted in response. This great victory is only thanks to you, and it shall not go unrewarded. Rob called out to their men. Tonight, 3 barrels of ale will be provided for all those that fought today. You will feast to this victory. All soldiers cheered loudly, as his brother rode over to him personally. Together, they walked inside the keep to where Lord Ronald Vance was guarding the highborn prisoners. There were a dozen landed knights, but much more important were the members of House Caswell. Lady Alisanne Caswell, the Lady of Bitterbridge, stood there together with her family. A young girl, no older than 10, was clutching her skirts. Next to the girl stood an older boy and girl in their early teens. Her 3 youngest children, he presumed. Lady Caswell had borne 7 children to her late husband. Her 2 eldest daughters were married off to other houses in the Reach, and her 2 eldest sons were fighting with the Tyrell army. However, 2 more women stood beside her. One carried an infant on her arm, while the other tried to hide 2 toddlers behind her. These must be Lady Caswell's sons' wives, with her grandchildren. Capturing them was a great victory, and he was surprised that they had remained here instead of fleeing to Highgarden. Lastly, there was an older man with a greybeard behind her and her immediate family. He was dressed for battle in mail and plate, his tabard undistinguishable as it was cut to pieces and smeared with mud and blood. The knight sported fresh battle wounds, his arm hung in a sling and blood was slowly dripping from a cut underneath his eye. He was clutching an older woman in his good arm, and she was protecting several toddlers grouped around her as well. The older man was introduced as the commander of the garrison, and a maternal cousin of Lady Alisanne. Rob promised them that he would treat them with respect, after formally accepting their surrender. Not much later, they were all led back inside and held under house arrest until they could be transported to the Riverlands. After most of the other people had left the hall, he walked over to his brother and king together with Bryn. Rob grabbed him in a hug with a large smile on his face. "Congratulations on your victory, little brother. You executed the plan perfectly. It will not go unrewarded." He answered the brotherly embrace in kind but waved away his words. "The only reward that I want is for this war to be over quickly and for all of our family to come out of it unscathed." Rob nodded seriously at that, as Ricard walked over to them. "As do I, Bran." Nevertheless, the smile crept back soon. "Nonetheless, both you and your son deserve rewards, which you will receive in due time. You deserve to live out the rest of your lives as rich and fat men soon." Now it was his time to laugh. "Don't project your desires onto us, brother. It doesn't become of you." All 4 Starks laughed, and Bryn walked away with his uncle and cousin as he took it upon himself to check upon his men. Today had been a great victory, but it had come at a certain cost. He would see to the dead and visit the wounded himself. They deserved it, after shedding their blood for him and his family. 5 days later. John Whitefy. He had looked upon the arrival of the Vale detachment with interest. The 9,000-strong force was made up of many different houses, but its cohesion was clear for all to see. At the helm of its column rode Princess Birena Stark's husband, Sir Allard Royce. He was the nominal leader of the coalition, in the name of his lordly father who had remained in Runestone to keep an eye on the Arryns, after King Harold had refused to honor their alliance. Nonetheless, the presence of Lords Redfort and Templeton could hardly be missed. Both flanked the Royce, clearly holding the respect of both the army and that of its young commander. The arrival of the reinforcements had further bolstered morale, but he hadn't gotten a chance to celebrate with his men. Rob had immediately motioned for him to join the conversation, and as such he was now walking towards a secluded council chamber inside Bitterbridge. Once there, he took the seat to the left of Rob, as Ricard lately occupied his right side. Opposite Rob sat the Royce, with Lords Redfort, Templeton and Donijah also in attendance. After the usual niceties had been exchanged, and bread and salt had been offered, the meeting started in earnest. "I received a letter from your father that your forces number around 9,000 men, is that correct, Sir Allard?" his brother asked the heir to Runestone. The young knight nodded eagerly. "Yes, it is. We even surpassed that number slightly. The men are disciplined and well rested, ready and eager for action." "That is great to hear, Sir Allard," his brother replied. "We have of course heard the reports and seen the sea of tents present here, but we are curious to know the exact number that you raised as well, King Rob." Lord Redfort interjected. It was Ricard who answered. "Our army here now numbers 43,000. 3,000 men remain in the North March under the command of my younger brother, while another 1,000 are scattered in garrisons in numerous small towns and strategically important holdfasts along our supply roads. All of those can be ordered to rejoin the main host in short notice when news about Tyrell's presence finally trickles in." "You still don't know where he is?" Lord Templeton asked in surprise. "It won't be long now. We will know soon," Rob answered stoically. "The recent fall of Bitterbridge will force his hand. Soon, we will start our march on Highgarden in earnest." He will need to confront us before we ever reach his seat. If I were him, I would prefer to do it sooner than later. He explained, which seemed to satisfy the Valiman. Lord Jasper Redfort looked at his 3 countrymen, before hesitatingly speaking up. We were glad to see that Bitterbridge was spared the fate of Tumbleton. The sights we saw there, and the stories we heard, were gruesome. Was this necessary, King Stark? The Vale Lord asked his brother. It was clear that the Valiman had talked about this amongst themselves, as all perked up immediately. Robb nodded. Aye, sadly it was. The Footless pillaged and burned all throughout the Riverlands for months. They slaughtered my people, burned their holy places and destroyed their homes. Hundreds of traitors from the Riverlands had taken refuge in Tumbleton, and to top it all off you had Lord Footless' daughter who claimed the Riverlands for her unborn child. Robb answered the question. He knew that his brother had had personal doubts about the execution of the operation, but none of that was visible now. He told it as if it had been his own idea. Robb was too smart to ever show doubt in the face of their allies. Ricard looked more surprised at the determination at which his father defended an approach that hadn't been entirely his. Nonetheless, his nephew recovered quickly and regained his cold neutral composure. That were just too many slights to accept. Robb continued. Something had to be done. An example had to be set. Sadly, it seemed that the rest of Westeros needed to be reminded of the grave fate that awaits ones who challenges House Stark. That has now been corrected. The Vale Lords shuffled uneasily on their chairs after the warning that sounded awfully much like a threat. From your words I can deduce that no such acts are to be expected in the future. Sir Allard carefully asked. Aye, you can. Our point is made. Pillage and plunder will continue, it is a war after all, but no great examples will need to be made anymore. His brother confirmed, to the satisfaction of most of the Valiman. Lord Simon Templeton then switched topics. You mentioned marching on Highgarden. How are you planning to supply such a huge force? Especially now that our men have joined you. Won't Garland just wait until the army is divided, before striking out of nowhere? Ricard grinned at that. Aye, that would be our plan too, if we were him. Sadly, for him, that plan won't work. Lord Simond looked questioningly at Rookie. What my royal nephew is trying to say, is that there is no need for us to divide the army. He explained. The plunder that our soldiers and foragers have assembled is enough to feed our entire army with your soldiers and the other expected reinforcements as well. Now all men in front of them raised their eyebrows. You can feed an army over 50,000 men? Sir Allard asked. Other reinforcements? Lords Donijah and Redfort remarked. Robb nodded. The Reach has been good to us, and its harvests plentiful. None of the troops will lack for anything on our march to Highgarden. My youngest son John will join us with his men soon, and a few thousand Stormlanders under Prince Consort Edric Baratheon are also underway. That last part seemed to surprise them. The Stormlanders are coming. Lord Jasper Redfort asked. We heard that they were having trouble with the Dornish. We hadn't expected any more of their assistance in this war. All 3 of them nodded, the same annoyance directed at the situation visible on their faces. He himself answered. Aye, it seems that Houses Fowler, Wyl and Euron would have been persuaded by Garland to align with him and raid the Dornish marches. No word has come from Sunspear, and it seems like the Martells are not going to join the conflict. Nonetheless, their vassals have taken it upon themselves to attack the unprotected borderlands of the Storm Kingdom. His nephew jumped in then. Crown Prince Robert Baratheon had rejoined his father after his victories at Ashford. He is now marching towards the burning lands of Houses Selmy, Dondarrion and Caron with a force of around 12,000 men. The remaining 7,000 Stormlanders will be joining us in the next few days. Whatever victories Garland conjures up, we will outnumber him when the inevitable clash comes. All his victories have been achieved by overwhelming his enemies with larger number or the power of surprise. Against us, he will have neither. This seemed to take the Valiman aback, but they all seemed pleased. A worrying frown soon returned to Lord Donijah's face though. It is true then. What we heard about the Lannisters. Robb's jaw tightened. Aye, it is. His brother almost spat out. The Lannisters have concluded a separate peace treaty with Lord Redwyne. Their troops have already evacuated Red Lake. Soon, Garland will be able to reunite with the thousands of men that he had sent west to fight them. The inevitable clash is close now. Lord Donijah seemed to mull those words over, while he himself thought back at the news they had received 10 days ago. The Lannisters had suffered an embarrassing defeat on their own lands at the hand of Lords Hightower and Redwyne. The Reachman cavalry had ridden across the border into the Westerlands and defeated 5,000 Lannister reinforcements that had been headed towards Red Lake. Almost 4,000 Westermen had been slaughtered in a battle which had also seen the deaths of Lords Tybalt Crickehall and Jaime Kenning as well as Sir Stefan Swyft, King Willem's maternal uncle. King Willem had apparently been so shocked by the surprising loss of those men, and some of his staunch allies, that he had made a quick peace with the Reachmen. His force had pulled back from the Reach, notably accompanied by all the loot they had thus far been able to gather there. This feat had almost ensured a decisive clash, as Redwyne was now racing 20,000 soldiers back towards the heart of the Reach after leaving garrisons and sending 2,000 men to counter and delay the Ironborn advance. Ironically, the raiders seemed the most reliable of all their allies. They had by now taken the second fort at the mouth of the Mandea, allowing them to raid upstream. In Bitterbridge alarming messages had been found signaling their longships no more than a dozen miles from Highgarden. Nonetheless, they seemed unable to capture any large keeps on the mainland. A second son of Lord Harras Harlaw had died in a failed assault on Old Oak, after the seat of House Oakert had been secretly reinforced by the Western Reachman force. They talked some more about the details of the front, until Lord Redfort brought up another issue. "I have seen and heard that you are sending many prisoners to the wall." The three of them nodded, expecting a question to follow this statement. They didn't have to wait long. "Don't you think it is dangerous to send them all north now? Your lands have been depleted of troops and a rebellion of the Watch could threaten your kingdom and end this war to our detriment." Robb nodded understandingly. It could. That's why we're not sending them all to the wall just yet. We have sent an early batch of 200 men to Castle Black at the beginning of the rebellion in the Riverlands. Afterwards, all captives headed for the wall have been spread over Moat Cailin, Castle Sewin, Winterfell and Last Hearth. They will be held there until we return north. The only men that are still allowed to take their oaths now are craftsmen, because the Watch has a severe shortage of them. New captives from the Reach are sent by ship to White Harbour, Old Castle, Ramsgate, the Dread Fort and Flint's Finger and will be held there as well. You will have all those integrated at once after the war. Won't that mean a takeover of the Watch by the Reach and rebellious Riverlander factions?" Lord Templeton asked. He jumped into the conversation there. "As my kingly brother said, 200 rebels have already taken their vows months ago. They are being spread out over the castles of the Night's Watch as we speak and will be largely pacified by war's end. The craftsmen will also have been integrated. The rise in new recruits after the war will be a challenge, but they will have to compete with the other existing factions, like the last former rebels from the Vale or the remainder of Tywin's supporters. There is also a very large northern faction, augmented by volunteers from all over Westeros." The Valiman followed attentively. "You also have to keep in mind that years at the wall create a brotherhood and friendships across national lines. Most of the 4,000 men at the wall are loyal to the Night's Watch first and foremost. Old loyalties have largely made place for new ones. For the last 20 years, men who fought on both sides of the past wars have led the wall together. I don't expect a lot of trouble, but House Umber and the Mountain clans will keep a close eye on the situation nonetheless," Robb added. This seemed to pacify the worries of the Vale Lords. After a few more conversations about logistical issues, they ended the meeting. He took his leave and went to look for his sons. He found his youngest at his encampment. He was having lunch around a campfire with a few of his lieutenants and some sons of the local nobility. Benjen immediately stood up to greet him when he saw him, and his companion Rotary happily waddled over to him. The existence of the animal still perplexed him, but by now it was clear that it would survive. He scratched Rotary behind the ears, as he inspected the animal for the millionth time. He was snow-white, with large spots of dark grey around his left eye, belly and rear. By now, he had reached a height of around 5 feet, but his growing had slowed down considerably and was soon expected to stop. For years his sons had wanted direwolves of their own, but Rob had forbidden it. 2 years ago, he had finally managed to convince his kingly brother to allow him to try to breed Ghost with the wolfhounds in his kennel. Neither of them had expected it to show any results, and for a long time it had seemed to be that way. Insemination had been notoriously difficult, but they had made it work. This had only resulted in 3 bitches dying during pregnancy, all 17 pups dying within hours of their premature births. The process had cost him a lot of coin, but he hadn't been able to deny his sons their wish and had continued to fund it all against the advice of his kennel master. That had been the way of thing, until weeks before they had left for the Riverlands. A 4th bitch had successfully been impregnated a while back, and she had carried her pups for much longer than the others. Still, she had died 3/4 into her term. Yet, when they cut out the 4 pups, not all had died immediately. 2 had survived the night, to the elation of his sons. His eldest son's pup had nonetheless died a few days later, but against all odds Benjen had managed to keep his own pup alive. He had nurtured him all throughout the campaign, only leaving him out of his sight to fight and attend command meetings. The direwolf-wolfhound hybrid had grown considerably, and loved playing with both the armies, considerably smaller, dogs and his, considerably larger, direwolf cousins. Rob had been skeptical about the animal at first, thinking it an abomination that defied his ruling. Yet, when it became clear that Rotary would never reach the size or power of Ghost, his brother had relented. His son's wolf licked his hand affectionately, as Ghost protectively stood over his only living son. In contrast to his father, Rotary wasn't a mute. Nonetheless, all kennel masters agreed that he was very silent. Unlike other canines, he only barked when extremely happy or when feeling danger. Seldomly, he could also be heard whining for food, but only to his son Benjen. The name Rotary had been Benjen's idea. Rotary was an old, large and friendly wolf in ancient stories from the time of the first men. Never in the stories was it mentioned that he was a direwolf, yet he was mentioned as very large for his kind. The name had received praise from the boys' Stark cousins for its references to their first men heritage and the historical distinction that the old Rotary had not been a direwolf, which they saw as a confirmation that Benjen's companion was an entirely different breed on its own that they had dubbed direhounds. The young Stark's praises had been a large factor to Rob agreeing with the current events. He sat down with Benjen, after greeting him and the other nobles present. "Where is your brother?" he asked his son, after receiving a roasted chicken leg from one of his vassal's sons. "Edric is off with his Umber relations. They were last seen going over towards the Vale army, as they started to set up camp to the east," Benjen replied. He silently nodded in response, while thinking the information over. He ate his food and exchanged conversation with the youthful nobles sworn to him, as well as some of his more veteran lieutenants. When he had finished, he stood up. "I am going to find your brother. You have command of the camp," he told his youngest son, who nodded understandingly before going back to his conversation with Toggen Flint's youngest son. After a lot of asking around, he found his heir and 4 of his young friends, among which was Moore's Umber, sitting together with a large group of men wearing Templeton livery. When he saw him, he immediately got up. "Father! What brings you here? Let me introduce you to some of my new friends, most of them seem to be long-lost kin of ours," Edric joyfully exclaimed. He sat down, as his 19-year-old heir explained that most of the young knights and squires around him were all relations of Lord Simond Templeton. His 2 youngest sons were there, together with 3 of his nephews. On top of that, you had 5 cousins, from both male and female lines. All apparently descended from Jocelyn Stark, who had married into a junior branch of House Royce, and whose descendants had remained in the Vale. Her youngest daughter had married the Knight of Templeton, and all the young men around him were descended from that couple. He greeted them all warmly, as he silently rejoiced in the ability of his eldest son to make friends so quickly. It was something he had inherited from his mother, not from him. It was also good for their alliance and house to have him befriend some of the young Vale nobles. Edric had the ear of both Rob and Rookie. Him making friends with the Valiman would help to integrate their armies into one. Something that would be crucial, if they wished to beat Tyrell once and for all. The Templeton nobles asked him a lot about House Stark, Rob, Winterfell and the North. He had to laugh at their curiosity but answered them all as freely as he could. he in turn asked after the health of some of his old battle companions from the Vale and their families. Many of them had now gotten families of their own, who were now in the process of intermarrying. The young sons of Lord Simond were both engaged already, one to Anne Linderley and the other had recently heard from his father that he would marry a daughter of Lord Donijah when they got back. Even the nephews were subjects of political marriages. Those furthest in line to Templeton vassals, the oldest to cadet branches of other important nobles. He let all the information sink in, as he assessed the political situation in the Vale. These betrothals were an important metric of the relations between the noble houses. He wanted to remember them, as they could give him insights into the divided state of the Vale. After a surprisingly interesting few hours of conversation, his son and the other Northmen left with him. Together, they walked back to their encampment and reunited with Benjen. He had dinner with his sons then and was later joined by his daughter's husbands Benfred Tallheart and Bim Flint for a few mugs of ale. They reminisced about the North, and their family. The hot southern night got to them, and before they knew it, they had all drunk more than they should have. He looked over the four intoxicated young men in front of him. They were laughing, as they jested about how a Flint squire had embarrassed himself a few days ago. These men were the future of his house. The noble family that he had never expected to have in his youth. In silent prayer, he thanked the gods for the small miracle in front of him. In his prayer, he also lauded his brother. Without him, none of this could have been possible. Chapter 94, Battle of Fallen Flowers. 29 AC. Ricard. He was abruptly awoken by his cousin and Squire Rion. Your father has demanded that you meet him in the command tent immediately, Prince Ricard. The Sawin youth told him, as he hovered over him. He wiped away the crusts in his eyes, as he adjusted to the dim light around him. It looked to be early dawn, and if his father needed him now then it must be serious. He got out of his bed, washed his face and put on a tunic and some light pants. He didn't bother facing away as he changed in front of his 15-year-old cousin. After a year of sharing a tent, there was nothing that he hadn't seen before. Before leaving, Rion handed him his sword belt and he adjusted it, and the dagger hanging from it as he left in a hurry. Sadikan silently marching next to him. When he approached his father's tent, he could see Cedric Sawin standing watch. While walking past him he nodded at the Kingsguard, who bowed his head in response. Rion stayed outside, as he talked with his distant kinsman outside the door. Sadikan silently took his place next to his sworn brother. He found his father standing around the wooden table, maps scattered across it. His uncle John was already there, as well as Lord Umber and his cousin Hoster. His royal father looked up at him and seemed pleased at his arrival. Thank you for coming so quickly, son. Your brother, uncles and the other important nobles will arrive here soon. His father's words rang true, as over a dozen men, all heirs or lords of important houses, arrived in the next 10 minutes. He greeted his brother, uncles and cousins, before his father got down to business. Welcome to all of you. I know that you are all wondering why I have awoken you all this early and abruptly. Well, it seems that Tyrell has finally come out to play. His army has been spotted 4 miles to the west from here. The scouts tell me that they are in the process of taking their battle formations. Garland Tyrell is inviting us to do battle, and I am planning to oblige him. His father started off, the tension in the room quickly rising as everybody reacted to the news. Some looked concerned or serious, others grinned with grim satisfaction. Now was finally the time that all of them had been preparing for these past months. You all know the battle plans by now, but I will quickly summarize them again before the meeting with our allies after this. His father continued. Our army numbers 6 to 2,000 men, the largest army we have ever fielded. We will fight in a classic formation. Our infantry will be divided into 3 blocks who will be fighting next to each other. We outnumber our opponents and we will make sure we keep a long front to stretch them thin. Grunts of approval came from within the tent. The center will be made up of 14,000 Northmen, under the command of my son Ricard. Many looked at him and voiced their support. He nodded back in gratitude. His seconds in command will be my brother Brandon, Lord John Umber and Lady Daisy Mormont. The left infantry, also 14,000 strong, will be under the command of Lord Hoster Tully and will consist of the Riverlander and Stormlander infantry. Prince Stannis Baratheon and Lord Brynden Blackwood will be his seconds in command. All seemed to accept this. The right infantry, again 14,000 strong, will consist of Valyman and Northmen. Its leader will be Sir Allard Royce. He will be aided in his command by Lords Simond Templeton and Cleesa Wynn. The right cavalry will consist of 6,000 Northern horse and will be commanded by my brother John. My youngest son Prince John will aid him in this endeavour, together with Lords Domeric Bolton and Timothy Flint. His father decreed, and now he saw some of his younger countrymen shuffle. All northern commands this far, except those of himself and his brother, had gone to old war companions of his father. He knew that some, like the Karstarks, Dustins and Mardaelis had been hoping for a change in command to get a chance to prove themselves. Their king just ignored it. The left cavalry will consist of 7,000 horsemen, coming from the Stormlands, Vale and Riverlands. It will be led by Prince Consort Edric Baratheon and his seconds in command will be Lord Redfort and Sir Patrek Mallister. 4,000 archers will be just behind front line, under the command of Lord Damewell Deddings. The rearguard will once again consist of 2 groups, 1 cavalry and 1 infantry. I will personally command the 1,500 northern horse, while Prince Rickon will command the 2,500 foot hailing from all possible regions. He will be aided by Lord Hayford and Harlon Sumber. The last 2 names surprised him, but they were clever additions. Harlon was a friend of his, the heir to a new house with deep ties to both the North and the Riverlands. Lord Martin Hayford was a few years his elder, but he also had strong ties to the North, while ruling in the Riverlands. This at last ensured that some people from the new generation received commands, although some still looked annoyed. Both of their lands were also situated close on the border with the Stormlands, which had as a result that they had good relations with some of their allies. His father answered questions about the battle plan, while he went over to talk to the 3 men that would serve just under him in the coming battle. All 3 congratulated him again with his command, as he told them how he envisioned everything. 14,000 men were too much to control directly, so he would divide his own block in 3 smaller ones in the front and a 4th one in the back. He would take control of the middle one with Lord Umber taking the right and Lady Mormont the left. His uncle Brandon would be in charge of the back lines, his most important task to ensure that the troops were rotating in and out of the fight. He would only charge into the fight when forcing a break or stopping holes from forming in their lines. After the meeting was finished and everyone had left the tent, he walked over to his father. "You mostly chose veterans from your past wars for command. My generation is getting restless," he remarked. His kingly father scoffed. "Let them be restless. The men from your generation have gotten more than enough opportunities to prove themselves during the past campaign, and they will get many more of those once we have defeated Garland's host. This battle will decide the future of this campaign, and the position of our kingdom south of the Neck. This is no moment for young men to demand easy glory." He nodded understandably. "Nonetheless, we will need to give them something. In the future, these will be the lords that I will need to count on during my reign. I would like them experienced and not disgruntled, if at all possible." His father sighed. You're right, but today is not the day. We keep to the plan. Smalljan, Clee, Dacey, Domeric, your uncles. I know them through and they are loyal to the bone. They will not fail us. That is what we need now. Nevertheless, I will give the youth more opportunities after the battle. Especially those who are here to represent their houses alone. I'm thinking about the Karstarks, Dustins and Mardaelis, but also Sir Limond Bracken, Lord Barthogan Rosby, Meuron Reed, Lord Goran Glover and Lord William Mouton," he added. His father nodded. You're right, but not now. Now, we prepare for this battle," he commanded, as he clapped his shoulder. Together they walked outside of the command tent. Silently, they split up to go to their respective tents. His Sowyn cousin quickly fell into step. In his tent, Rion helped him to adorn his armor. After his mail and partial plate was strapped on, he helped his squire with the latest preparations for his own armor. Edarion would not be fighting on the front lines, but he would serve by his side as a messenger and would need to be shielded against all kinds of harm. Together, they walked out of his tent and saddled their horses. He nodded to Sir Dickon Brune and Cedric Sewin, the 2 members of the King's Guard that would serve at his side during the battle, and together with a small guard they rode towards the enemy. 2 hours later, he was examining the enemy line from amidst his soldiers. Tyrell had gathered some 40,000 men, he estimated. They were similarly positioned as their own men, the majority of the infantry in the middle and cavalry on the flanks. Archers stood in front and a reserve could be seen atop a hill in the back. He knew that the battle could start at any moment and tightened his grip around the worn leather-wrapped hilt of his sword. To his right and left, the men of Winterfell's northern levy formed a steadfast spear wall, their faces grim and determined. He took a deep breath, letting the sharp tang of iron, sweat, and churned earth fill his senses, grounding him. Finally, the waiting was over. A dozen horn blasts split the silence, the shrill sounds of trumpets echoing in response from across the field. He raised his own sword, signaling to his men. He knew their loyalty was not just to his house but to him. The unsatiated wolf some in the army had started to call him, because of his habit to continue on until all objectives were captured and all enemies defeated, no matter how long it took. He didn't mind. "Advance!" he shouted, his voice echoing over the field. War horns blasted, taking over his command. Thousands of soldiers started to march, the rhythmic sound of their boots hitting the ground accompanying them on their march. Arrows flew in both directions, but he paid them no mind. Luckily, they didn't have to walk far, as the enemy also closed in on them. "Shield wall!" he screamed, and the first line raised their shields, before crashing into the enemy. He steeled himself for the impact, which he felt even from somewhere in the 8th rank. His heart hammered in his chest for a quick second, but he felt a surge of fierce pride as none of the men around him moved a step backwards. Both lines had crashed against each other, none of the lines budging an inch as the thousands of bodies behind them held the men from the first line in place, quickly replacing anyone that was struck down. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the low hum of murmured prayers and the clang of steel. He could see the fear in some of his men's eyes, a mirror of his own inner turmoil at the sight of thousands of Reachman soldiers crashing against their line. But he straightened, letting his gaze harden. A prince of Winterfell had no room for fear. A direwolf didn't fear roses, he trampled them. The first minutes were brutal, a cacophony of metal on metal, screams, and the sickening crunch of weapons meeting flesh. He himself was too far away from the fighting to be in danger, which gave him an opportunity to assess the situation and exchange messages with his commanders. All went according to plan for now, but slowly and surely, he was pushed forward as dead men were replaced and the first exhausted soldiers were rotated out. Eventually, he found himself face to face with an aging soldier clad in battered armor, his face smeared with dirt and blood, eyes wild with desperation. He dodged a blow aimed at his head, feeling the wind of it as it passed, and countered with a quick slash to the man's side, feeling the jolt as his blade found its mark. Around him, his men were locked in close combat, the line shuddering but holding. The stench of blood and sweat filled the air, and he could hear his own breathing, ragged, as he parried and struck, moving with practiced precision. For a moment, it was as though he had been transported back to the training yards, the clash of wood on wood replaced now with steel and sinew. All that was missing was the stern voice of his Uncle Tor, who had taught him most of his sword lessons. A man to his left fell with a strangled cry, clutching his side, but another took his place almost instantly. The enemies kept coming. He dodged, blocked and countered, but for every enemy that he hit, 2 more came to take his place. He fought for what felt like ages until he finally felt his arms tire. He shouted for the men behind him to rotate and take his place, as he stepped back into the relative security of the northern line. He gathered his breath and looked at his guard of friends and protectors. His father had gathered an honor guard for him, consisting of nobles from all over the north. Most seemed to be here, although he couldn't find Torben Flint, Lord Timothy's amusing cousin. He looked around, and awaited messages to reach him. However, all that Rion had to tell him was that the line was holding. He gathered his thoughts and stretched his arm, before walking forward once again back into the fray. John Whitefy. He sat at the front of his cavalry force. 6,000 mounted northern warriors ready to pounce on the enemy when he gave the command. Lord Timothy Flint was in the rear, ensuring that the group stayed together during the charge and giving him the possibility to rally the troops if something went wrong. His nephew and namesake, Little John, was beside him, and together they would control the main charge. Domeric had been given special command of 1,500 riders. He would command the middle, and was allowed to direct forces to split off from the force to exploit gaps in the enemy lines. Domeric was by far the best and most mobile cavalry commander. He trusted his judgment with his life. He watched the battle commence, as the infantry crashed against each other in the middle, with the flanks doing the same not much later. The enemy right flank, his main target, had charged down from the slight hill to clash into their own troops. The line of fighting was vast, hundreds of men wide, and only stopped some 200 yards from a close-by tree line. The enemy cavalry was feinting to get them to commit too soon, but he wouldn't fall for that. He raised his hand in a fist, to let the men know they had to hold. The horses were getting restless from the sounds and smells of battle, but now was not yet the time. Ghost and Fang stood beside them, quietly taking in the battle that was unfolding on their flank. They were both in extreme control of their companions, his nephew having been trained and instructed in his warging capabilities by his family in secret for almost a decade. Suddenly, to his surprise, the enemy cavalry opposite them moved in earnest. Their most recent feint didn't seem to be a feint at all, as thousands of southern horsemen galloped forward, clearly aiming to charge at their right flank. They already neared the tree line close at the edge of their infantry formation. He cursed loudly. They had taken him by surprise. "Charge, men!" he screamed, and the war horns were sounded, as he urged his horse forward. Thousands of veteran riders followed him, as they surged forward. He cursed again, as he saw the enemy cavalry in front of him turn and barrel straight into the flank of their own men. The far right of their line, consisting of Valiman under Lord Simon Templeton, was buckled severely, with hundreds of infantrymen being trampled in front of his eyes. It was a bold move which heavily damaged their position, but it was also desperate. They fielded more infantry than the enemy did, and, while this helped the enemy greatly to even the scales, it wouldn't break their own flank. The desperate move would come to cost them dearly. He would turn and charge the enemy in the back, pinning them between the Vale infantry and his horsemen. He would annihilate the cream of the Reach nobility at the start. Now, maybe Domeric could exploit the opening to wreak havoc in their rear. He slowed down slightly, to allow the horsemen behind him to fall in line with him. In front of the tree line, they turned in a similar motion as the enemy had done before them. He lowered his lance, preparing to pierce it into some knight's back, when he was suddenly interrupted with the sound of bows loosening. He looked around and, to his shock, he saw how a few hundred archers had emerged from the close-by tree line. They must have been hidden behind it long before the battle had started. How they had missed this he did not know. The arrows flew into the sides and backs of his cavalrymen, as confusion and fear spread to parts of their grouping. Its damage weakened their charge, but was not nearly serious enough to break it. Before he could contemplate on what to do, he charged into the fray, and thousands of his riders with him. He missed the first rider in front of him, as he was wrapping his head around the archer situation. Luckily for him, Ghost barreled into the opponent's horse, neutralizing any threat the knight would have posed to him. He shook of his doubts and struck his lance into the thigh of a knight who was charging towards his nephew. He left it there, pulling out his sword as he rode on. Their horsemen pierced through the enemy back line, and it soon turned into a chaotic melee with riders from both camps emerging from all directions. A knight dressed in dark red colors rode up to him from his left, and he brought up his shield to block the man's morning star from connecting with his helmet. The iron spikes took out a small part of the woodwork, but they didn't pierce through. He pulled at his reins to order his horse to turn and managed to swing at the knight with his sword as he did so. It was a well-aimed strike, but the knight had seen it coming and blocked it with his own shield. Instead of breaking apart, the knight turned his horse in the opposite direction of him, and they traded blows as they turned around each other in circles. His sword flashed towards the man's helmet, shoulder and thigh, but was consistently countered by his opponent's shield. Similarly, he caught all strikes from the enemy morning star. They continued to circle around each other, until a powerful strike of the knight pierced his shield just under his arm. The impact of the blow could be felt through his whole body, but he didn't let the opportunity go to waste. He pushed his shield forward, making it impossible for the knight to pull out his weapon, which had become stuck in his shield. He relentlessly hammered blows upon the rider, as he desperately tried to free his weapon. His first strikes were blocked by the shield, but a cunning slash managed to hit the knight's thigh. The maroon colors of his tabard turned crimson, as blood flowed from the wound. Openings now began to appear, and he hit the reachman upon his elbow and shoulder, before seeing him yank back in pain. The movement created an opening between his helmet and mail at the neck, and he immediately directed a vicious slash towards it. Blood spurted out, as he had cut the carotid artery. The knight fell from his horse, as blood was sprouting from his neck, mouth and nose. He didn't spare him a second glance and continued on. In a flash, he recognized Sir Jeremy Biglestone from the King's Guard in front of him, but he vanished again as soon as he came while chasing behind some enemy rider. He crossed swords with another rider, but his adversary was soon hit on the back of the head by a northern mounted soldier. By the time his lifeless body fell on the ground, he had already started seeking another opponent. Ghost was a constant menace at his side, who prevented any enemy from charging him in the back. Together they fought off multiple attacks, as friend and foe fell around him. They largely had the upper hand, and their advantage seemed to be growing. Suddenly, everything changed, as numerous enemy riders seemed to charge in from behind them. Where they came from, he did not know, but fear quickly struck him. While fending off the incoming attackers, he frantically looked around for the direwolf banner, which would symbolize his nephew's presence. He saw it waving behind him, in the direction from which the enemy was coming. He rallied as many of his men as he could and charged towards it, blocking strikes from 3 consecutive enemies that raced past him. The fourth one who did so, he countered with a slash to the back of his head as he rode past. The stunned knight fell from horse, his body trampled within seconds by the hooves of his allies behind him. In front of him, he saw the banner go down and he sped up even further. Ghost must have felt his fear, as he charged on. The terror his companion caused to the enemy horses clearing a path for him to follow. The sight he came upon was bad. His nephew and a dozen of his companions were encircled by an endless stream of enemies. Little John had lost his helmet, and blood was streaming from the side of his face. Sir Jeremy Biglestone rode beside him, desperately protecting the prince's flank from all assailants. To his shock, he recognized another of the prince's companions as he rode towards them. His 16-year-old son Benjen was fighting back-to-back with his cousin, as both their companions Rorai and Fang attacked in all directions. He viciously slashed at a rider who had come up on his flank, severing the man's hand from his arm as his sword uselessly fell to the ground. Ignoring the shocked screams of his, now handless, opponent, he looked over his own shoulder and saw that a few dozen of his men had followed him. Together they charged to the aid of their countryman and prince. His men formed a circle around the desperate group, as he saw another one of his son's protectors, a dustin looking from his yellow tabard, fall to an enemy axe. "Benjen, John. We need to get out of here now," he screamed at them. Both looked tired, but they clenched their teeth and nodded. He took charge of the situation and ordered the group to ride back towards the infantry line. They tried to do so, but only moved slowly, as dozens of enemy riders came at them from all sides. The continuous stream of attacks took their toll, as more and more of their guards fell under enemy swords, amongst them Brandon Woolfield, Lord Manfred's eldest son. They seemed to be making ground, until a large group of enemy riders came upon them from the left wearing the colours of House Tarley. To his shock, he recognized Lord Dickon Tarley at the helm. The son of the late Lord Randall was King Garland's uncle and main military advisor. What was he doing here in this brazen cavalry charge? He would have never allowed his men to execute such a stupid move, and where were all their reinforcements coming from? Rorai charged the group, severing the neck of the horse of Tarlis' right-hand man and scratching another's belly. However, the young dire-hound had charged in too wildly. 3 Reachman knights wounded the animal with their lances in quick succession, as it pulled off the arm of a fallen Reacher knight. Lord Tarley rode up to it, and to their horror, he pierced his own lance right through the skull of his young son's companion. "Rorai, no!" His son screamed, and blind anger took hold of his youngest. He broke ranks and charged the group of knights, his princely cousin charging behind him with his direwolf to his own horror and that of Sir Jeremy. They had no choice but to follow them. Benjen, in his blind anger, sliced the arm off one of Tarlis' mounted soldiers until he clashed with another knight decorated in the colours of House Peak. Prince John was right behind him, managing to protect his flank against the Peak Knight's companions. Fang was not far away as he jumped a rider from his horse and mauled his head to pieces before they both reached the ground. Sir Jeremy immediately engaged the incoming swarm of Tali knights, and he stood beside him with Ghost. The two direwolves were clearly the only reason they managed to momentarily stem the tide of battle. "Get the prince out of here. I'll get my son," he shouted at the member of the Wolf's Guard, as his grey cape was sliced through by a reachman's axe. Without another word, the Riverlander knight turned his horse towards the prince. He took hold of the reins of Litjon's horse and forced them back. A dozen northern riders trying to cover their desperate retreat. He quickly dealt with the enemy standing between him and his son. He drove his blade forward, slipping it between the man's arm and his breastplate. The enemy rider slumped, his sword falling from his hand as he slid lifelessly from his horse. Subsequently, he grabbed his son's reins and forcefully turned his horse, but around him the remaining northern riders were already falling left and right. Suddenly, Lord Tali himself was upon them. He wielded his ancestral Valyrian steel sword Hearthspan from atop his horse, cleanly cutting off a corner of his shield when he raised it in response. He gritted his teeth and threw the thing away. It would be no use here. He pulled Frost, formerly known as Black Fear, from his back in response. Neither his longsword, nor his opponent's greatsword, were made to fight on horseback, but none of them minded this as sparks flew in the air every time the weapons connected. "Get out of here, Benjen!" he screamed to his son, as he exchanged blows with Daikon Tali. However, his young son, too blinded by pain and overcome with rage at his companion's killer, didn't listen. He charged right at Tali's back but was interrupted by two young knights wearing the same colors as his opponent. "My sons," Lord Daikon grinned from underneath his helmet as he swung a violent strike at his head. He blocked the attack, its power straining his already tired muscles further. One by one, the northern riders around them fell, until only he, Benjen and Ghost remained. "I will give you this one opportunity to surrender." Tali spat at him, as the lord deflected a strike he had aimed at his shoulder. "We will never surrender." His son screamed, and as such he could do nothing but fight on. Tali was good, and he couldn't get any advantage on him. Suddenly, he felt a jolt of pain in the back of his head. He twisted his head and saw how a rider had pierced Ghost's skin with a lance. His direwolf limped back towards them after killing the rider but was blocked from doing so by numerous horses from the reach. He blocked another attack, and took the opportunity to look how his son was doing. There, his worst nightmare suddenly came to pass. He saw the sword before he heard the scream, as one of the Tali knights pierced his son's side with his weapon. He instinctively knew that the strike was lethal. Tears filled his eyes, as rage came over him. His entire life, he had tried to control the irascibility that ran in both his mother's and father's families. Seeing his young son killed in front of his eyes, all of this changed. In that moment, he didn't have any use for control. His son was dead, his life was already forfeit. All that mattered now, was to avenge his little boy. He locked swords with Hearthspan, before pushing it, and its handler, back. "A son for a son." He hissed back at him, as he violently turned around his horse. He charged at both Talis, one vicious slash dealing with the rider that came up to protect them, as his Valyrian steel sword cut right through the man's sword into the man's shoulder. He rode right in between the two Talis, at the last moment twisting his body towards the knight on the right, as it was the right one who carried his son's blood on his sword. He swatted away the young knight's sword as if it was nothing, before swinging at him all the strength he had left. He put all his anger, confusion and sadness into that swing. To his grim satisfaction, he felt the sword cleave through skin and bone like it was nothing. The young Talis head came loose from his neck and time seemed to slow down as he passed the headless corpse of his son's killer, its head slowly falling to the ground. He barely felt the pain in his back, as he concentrated upon the way the corpse of his son's killer fell unceremoniously from his horse. He rode on, but suddenly noticed that he had difficulty remaining in the saddle. His sword fell from his hands to the ground, and his hand slowly went to the dull pain in his lower back. To his shock, he felt blood gushing out of it. He looked at it, it was crimson red as it quickly covered his hands. He lost his balance and fell from his horse onto his back. The fall didn't hurt as much as he had expected, nor did his wound if he had to be honest. He raised his hands, as he looked at his blood glistering in the blistering southern sun. His gaze turned blurry, as he saw someone jump from his horse and walk towards him. He raised something, the object reflected more of the sun's light. He felt another sting, as his gaze turned dark. He barely felt it. All he could think about was his lost son, his remaining children and the sweet loving embrace of his Wyler. Rob. He looked upon the events that were unfolding in front of his eyes with increased shock. Everything had started out just as planned. The infantry had clashed, and their archers had immediately supported them. The line had safely held, and due to their extra manpower, it seemed like they would surely overpower them in time. Then the enemy left cavalry, some 3,000 strong, had rashly crashed into their right flank. Parts of their line had been swept away, but due to their extra manpower they had stabilized the front quickly. John had reacted swiftly and charged the enemy cavalry in the back. From that point on, everything had started going awry. Hundreds of archers had come out of the woodwork and pelted their northern cavalry in the back, still they had crashed in with significant strength and had quickly gained the upper edge, although it seemed messy. A group of northern riders from the back under the banner of Lord Flint had charged the archers to try and silence them, but suddenly, thousands of enemy cavalrymen had emerged from behind the hill. They had swept aside Lord Flint's men and charged the main body of cavalry in their back. The enemy charge came as thunder, a surge of bodies and raised lances. Their shouts rose as one, the sound carrying far across the battlefield, as they crashed against the northern rear like a wave. It had turned the fighting into complete chaos. For once in his military career, he had been stunned, but he had quickly snapped out of it due to the quick thinking of his youngest brother. Without waiting for his command, Rukon had advanced his infantry towards their right side, pikes and spears in the front and man-at-arms behind them. His brother's men quickly marched toward the right to stabilize the front line and prevent the Tyrells from rolling up their entire formation. He had seemingly also sent a unit of a few hundred spearmen to guard their archers, just in case. Inexplicably, the movements of the soldiers were also accompanied by the harrowing howls of all the direwolves in the vicinity, including Grey Wind. He quickly followed suit, having no time to think what his direwolf's howls meant as he rallied his horsemen and rode towards the fighting to prevent the enemy from exploiting their now open flank. He could see hundreds of northern horsemen escaping from the melee to all sides, only a single group, waving around the banner of the flayed man, carrying some resemblance of discipline. The pounding of hooves around him felt like thunder in his chest, each beat quickening as he spurred his warhorse forward. He mumbled a small prayer to the old gods, as he tightened his grip on his lance, feeling the weight of its pull slightly as they closed the distance with the enemy. Next to him, his good brother and commander of his king's guard did a similar thing. Together they crashed into the enemy side at the point of their formation. As always, Grey cut a path for them with a giant leap of a charge. He plunged his lance to the left into the side of an enemy rider, before pulling out his mace and quickly hitting another on the back of his head with it as he rode by. He rode deeper into the enemy formation, to his shock finding no countrymen still fighting inside it. As he charged on, he exchanged blows with enemy knights but was never able to hit any others until their charge was halted. In that moment, he got stuck in a duel with a knight wearing a light blue and yellow tabard, which had blood splatters all over it from earlier fights. Realizing that the blood must have come from one of his own countrymen, he channeled his anger into one of his swings. He hit the knight on the elbow of his sword arm, and he dropped his warhammer as a result. His next two hits were deflected by the reachman's shield, but the third hit him right in the face. A sickening crunch could be heard, as a serious dent appeared in the man's helmet as he pulled his mace back. His opponent's body motionlessly fell back from his horse, and he quickly engaged another. This one was dressed in the colors of House Tyrell. The knight aimed his sword at him, but completely missed his effort. As the rider barreled past him, he punched his shield into his face and followed this up with an overhead swing from his mace. He hit the rider on his shoulder. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it would seriously hurt. The rider quickly turned his horse around and rode away in retreat. He let him go, there were more than enough enemies around. Everywhere he looked, the battlefield was a maelstrom of flailing hooves, swinging swords, and shouting men. In the chaos of the melee, there was little room for finesse, it was brutal, close work, fought not only with weapons but with elbows, knees, and every ounce of strength a man could muster. His mace arced down, crashing onto the shoulder of yet another enemy, denting plate and cutting through chain mail and flesh. The man cried out, slipping from his saddle. He then saw something blink in the corner of his eye, and quickly kicked his horse to pivot, barely dodging a spear aimed at his side. He countered, slashing the spear-wielding rider across the chest, sending him reeling back in the saddle. He threw a glance back, and saw Sir Edmund and Grey Wind protecting his rear. Then a knight charged him from the left, shield raised high, sword poised for a killing blow. He threw up his own shield, deflecting the strike, then swung forward, hitting only air this time. The rider, wearing yellow birds on a field of green, barreled past him and disappeared into the fighting. The smell of sweat, blood, and churned earth filled his nostrils, as he desperately looked around for his missing son and brother. The melee whirled around him, a blur of flashing steel and thrashing horses. He saw one of his bannermen unhorsed, grappling with an enemy knight on the ground, and spurred his own horse forward to assist. Leaning down, he struck the enemy across the back, drawing the man's attention just long enough for his vassal to regain his footing and stabbed the enemy under his armpit with his dagger, before proficiently hopping onto a passing horse and rejoining the fray. To his shock, he recognized him as Edric Carstock, Harry On's eldest son. As he rode past, he felt a sting in his right shoulder. He quickly turned around in the saddle, noticing how a man on foot had managed to sneak up on him and land a glancing blow on his armor with his sword. Before he could lash out, Grey Wind suddenly emerged from behind the footman. One jump and one terrifying bite was all it took to deal with him, as he watched his direwolf spit out large parts of the soldier's neck and all the blood that accompanied it. Suddenly, he could see some of the enemy turn around and flee. Why he did not know, but he pressed on and so did his men. More and more of their opponents began to falter and flee. Yet not all did so. An enemy knight on horseback appeared before him, larger than the rest, wielding a massive war hammer. The knight's armor was blackened and spiked, his helm fully covering his face with only a small visor betraying a pair of brown hateful eyes. He gritted his teeth, urging his horse forward. They clashed, his mace ringing against the iron shaft of the knight's hammer. The man was powerful, each blow that the weapon connected on his shield reverberating through his bones. They exchanged swings, as their horses turned around each other, until he ducked under a sweeping strike, bringing his mace up in a vicious arc that caught the knight under his arm, crashing into the weak part of his armor. He heard ribs shatter under his blow and the knight swayed back and forth in the saddle, a strangled sound escaping his helm. Seconds later, he toppled from his horse, leaving him panting, his mace meaninglessly hanging from his arm next to him, the arm in question feeling too tired to lift it again. He glanced around, heart racing as he took stock. His men were pressing the enemy back, as the enemy cavalry fully routed. Tor rode up to him, he had lost his helmet, and a heap of half-dried blood covered the right side of his face. Nonetheless, he seemed to be well enough. Grey trotted over to him, suddenly whining softly. His direwolf took the reins of his horse in his maw and led them away from the battle to the back. In all their decades together, his direwolf had never done such a thing, so he decided to allow him to take the reins. He quickly motioned for Tor to follow him, as his direwolf took the lead. Grey Wind did so until they neared a hill with a small group of trees upon it a few hundred yards to the back of their formation. Tor, and Sir Edmund Grey, the two loyal men of his Wolfsguard, who had protected his back during the fighting, had rallied some 24 riders to follow him. As he neared the trees, he could see 2 war horses tied to a low-hanging branch. Grey Wind let out a low piercing howl, and it was answered with a similar sound from behind the hill. Yet, the other howl sounded weak and in pain. Shock took hold of him, as he realized a wounded direwolf found itself on the other side, and he quickly sped up, Grey happy that he finally understood the urgency of their mission. They crested the hill, only to find Sir Jeremy Biglestone and his youngest son there, looking concerned at the lying figure of Fang, his son's direwolf. The reason for their concern was clear, as the direwolf was bleeding from 2 bleeding wounds in his side, of which one looked very serious. Grey Wind walked over to his son and licked the young direwolf's face, as he whined softly. He turned around to the guards that had accompanied them. You and you, he pointed to the first 3, ride into camp and find a healer and my personal kennel master. Tell them that one of the direwolves is wounded and needs their immediate attention. Do this quickly and you will be rewarded beyond your imagination, act too slowly and punishment will await you. He barked his orders. All 3 lowered their heads in a small bow, before putting their spurs into their horses' flanks and racing off in the direction of the camp. He jumped off his horse to take a good look at his young son. His armor had been discarded and was lying among the roots of the trees, as he stood bare-chested under the southern sun. Caked blood could be seen all throughout his hair, probably coming from a small cut on the side of his forehead. Wounds upon his arms, shoulders and back had been bandaged with strips of his tunic. He was shocked to see so many of them, but none seemed to be too worrisome, as he moved reasonably normally when he came to hug him. He did so lightly, mindful of his son's many bruises, but with immense relief, as he looked over his son's sworn protector. Sir Jeremy had also discarded his armor, but he seemed even worse for wear. The knight was in the process of bandaging a nasty cut in his thigh, while blood still dripped from unattended wounds on his upper body, which looked blue and black from all the bruises. Tor and Sir Edmund jumped from their horses, and after making sure the perimeter was secure, moved to help their sworn brother. They silently ripped parts of their tunics and started making makeshift bandages for his many wounds. "What happened, John?" he asked his youngest son, whose eyes displayed nothing more than sorrow and defeat. Those grey-blue eyes, so like his mother's, looked to the ground as he started talking. "We charged the enemy cavalry from behind, but from the start everything went wrong. Archers shot us in the back continuously, as we beat back the enemy horse. Then we were suddenly engulfed by hundreds of enemy riders. I still have no idea where any of them came from. We soon found ourselves surrounded in a sea of enemies. Just as we thought we were lost, Uncle John showed up with a few dozen horsemen." His son's whole body shuddered as he retold the events. "He managed to get us moving again, and started to pull us away from the fighting, while my men and friends were killed all around us. Everything seemed saved, until Rory attacked too brazenly into oncoming Tarly horsemen and Lord Tarly killed Benjen's companion. Cousin Benjen charged to avenge him, and I tried to protect him, but we should have remained in line. Sir Jeremy and Uncle John charged the Tarlys to save us, and Sir Jeremy managed to pull me out. Both of us were wounded in our flight multiple times, but we would have surely perished if it weren't for Fang's help. He paid the price for it, as you can see," he said, as he pointed at the animal who was whining in pain to his direwolf father. Grey Wind nuzzled the young wolf, while he looked pleadingly into his eyes. "Help him." He constantly heard through the decades-old bond he had with his companion. He closed his eyes for a second and pulled at the strings at the back of his mind. Inside of his direwolf, he soothed him. "Help is on the way. It will be here soon," he told his companion from within, before pulling out again to listen to his own son. However, his son stopped and refused to look him in the eye. Then it hit him. "Where is your Uncle John?" His son let out a meek sigh, before steeling himself and looking at him. "Last I saw him, he was locked in personal combat with Lord Tarly while Benjen was engaging Tarly's sons. None of us saw anything from him anymore, but Fang let out a great howl when we were escaping the melee. I fear the worst." Grey and Shaggy also let out harrowing howls as we charged into battle. He whispered in shock. Without thinking, he slipped into Grey Wind and tried to locate Ghost. To his surprise, he managed to do so, and the animal seemed off in the direction of the army. He told his son as much, who still didn't look convinced it meant anything good. He walked over to Sir Jeremy, who confirmed what his son had told him. He helped bandage one of his wounds on his right forearm, and his own small wound on his shoulder was also looked at. When that was finished, the guards returned with a healer and his kennel master who quickly went to work on Fang. There was nothing more he could do here, so he left half a dozen guards under the leadership of Sir Edmund behind to protect his son and Sir Jeremy and rode back to his army. There he was met commanders, who congratulated him on the victory. He asked around, but none had heard from his brother, as he realized none of the commanders he encountered had actually been part of the right cavalry. He heard how the remainder of their battle plans had gone off as planned. Their left cavalry under Prince Consort Edric Baratheon had defeated its much smaller counterpart, before it had smashed into the enemy right infantry and had rolled up the Reachman's line. King Garland Tyrell had apparently been slain by Lord Redfort in the fighting in the middle, while trying to stabilize his front line. After this, the whole enemy army had routed. After a while, he finally found Ghost. The direwolf had also been severely wounded, and he was being tended to by a healer. Ghost's head lay in Edric's lap. John's eldest son looked at him with tears in his eyes, as Lord Domeric Bolton stood next him, his hand on the boy's shoulder, his facial features hard. His eyes found his eldest son a little further away, talking with some of his northern vassals. He would go over to him later. "Edric!" he shouted. "I am so glad to find you unharmed," he voiced, as he jumped off his horse. "Uncle," the young heir to Dragon's Lair acknowledged softly with an unconvincing nod of his head. He walked over to him and scratched Ghost behind his ear, as the direwolf whined softly and licked his hand. Edric just hugged Ghost without saying anything, which made him fear the worst. "Your Grace," his good brother addressed him. He switched his focus to the Lord of the Dread Fort. "I am saddened that I have the duty to inform you of the grave fate of your family. Your brother John and nephew, Benjen, have both perished during the battle." He looked at his nephew again in shock, who had seemingly lost his father and only brother, while a lump formed in his throat. "Are you sure of this?" he softly asked. Lord Domeric nodded. "I saw it happen with my own eyes, Your Grace. We were too far away to reach him to do anything." How did it happen?" he voiced slowly. Lord Domeric threw a glance at Edric, as if doubting whether it was good to tell this here. Still, he answered his question. "They got separated from Prince John and were engaged by Lord Tarly and his sons. When the young Tarlis struck down young Benjen, Lord John went into a rage. He leapt into a suicidal charge and beheaded one of Tarlis' sons, but was taken stabbed in the back because of it. My men are in the process of retrieving their bodies and his ancestral blade Frost." He absently nodded in thanks, as he shuffled over to his nephew. Without saying a word, he took his place on the ground next to him. He put his left hand on Edric's shoulder, as his right absently petted Ghost's flank. Grey Wind whined softly, as he put his head against that of his mute brother. His companion wasn't used to consoling his direwolf kin so much, but he did his best. Ghost turned his head towards him and he looked into the white direwolf's eyes to see a small shift occur inside them, as they looked intently into his own. Ghost's red eyes turned almost grey. With shock he remembered what one of his wilderling captives had told him when he had ventured with Bran behind the wall. When a warg's body dies, it is believed that his mind passes into the body of his animal. He bowed forward and whispered in the direwolf's ear, "John." The wolf licked his hand enthusiastically in response, nodding slowly in between. His eyes turned white. He looked up to tell the news to his nephew, but he remembered the presence of Lord Domeric, and many other nobles and soldiers around him. He would have to wait to tell John's son what he had seen. He stayed with Edric for a while, until he finally got up to attend the commander meeting, from which he immediately excused his nephew. "Take care of your father's body. I would like nothing more than to join you in this endeavor, but I cannot." "You can. All the nobles will understand your absence." John's son slowly nodded, as he kept absent-mindedly stroking Ghost behind his ear. With a heavy heart, and while fighting back tears, he climbed on his horse and rode towards his command tent with many of his nobles. On the way, some of his lords filled him in on other parts of the battle, while he remained silent. There he was informed about the last conclusive results of the clash. The Tyrells had fielded some 44,000 troops. 10,000 of them died, with a similar amount being captured. Those numbers will only go up, as hundreds of our horsemen are chasing the survivors to all corners of the land. Lord Hoster Tully explained to all the lords. "What are our own casualties?" Lord Redfort asked. His heir, who had taken charge in his absence, answered this question. "That depends greatly on which grouping. The losses to our archers are minimal, and infantry losses are also low, except for the Templeton detachment that was charged down by the initial attack on our right flank. Our cavalry suffered very severe losses, mainly the Northern Horse. All in all, we lost around 7,000 men, half of which were part of the Northern Cavalry. Some 2,000 of our men have also fled the battlefield, but most of them are expected to rejoin us in the coming days. In contrast to many of our earlier battles, the toll on our nobility was high." Ricard continued. "From the Vale, we lost Lord Simond Templeton, his nephew Sir Mathos Templeton, Sir Hugo Upcliffe and Sir Jasper Melcombe. From the Stormlands, the most significant losses were Lord Cedric Buckler and Sir Jeremy Kellington. They will all be missed." His heir looked to the nobles from these kingdoms, as he told them this. The friends and family of those named nodding appreciatingly at the gesture. Sirs Patrick Mallister, Lewis Smallwood, Alisander Goodwood and Ronald Vance have fallen from the Riverlands. His eldest son then paused and let out a deep sigh. From the north, notable losses include Lord John Whitefy, his youngest son Benjamin Whitefy, Lord Goran Glover, Lord Roger Riswell, Lord Timothy Flint and his cousin Torben, Lord Edmund Forrester, Brandon Woolfield, Hoarfrost Umber, Benjicott Dustin, Donald Slate, Morgan Vull, Theodore Little, Balder Krell, and Hodder Carsduck. He listened to all the names that were being called off. They hailed from all over the north, from Flint's Finger to Skagos, and from the Bight to the Rills. The personal toll to his family was immense. The gods hadn't been satisfied with only taking his brother and nephew. Edara's husband Lord Goran Glover and Arya's eldest son Meager had also died. All four had died with the cavalry on the right, as had most of the fallen northern nobles. Meager had apparently succumbed to a wound from an arrow in the back at the beginning of their charge. Witnesses had told him that Nymeria had gone crazy after Meager had been lethally wounded. She had dragged him out of the fighting and stayed with him until he died. Afterwards, she had raced to the center to be at his brother's side. Edarian Sawin, Arya's second son, had been serving in the center as his son's squire. As a squire, he mostly stayed out of the fighting, although he often found himself very close to the front line to relay messages and bring provisions that his son needed. According to witnesses, Nymeria had shown up near the end of the battle and had forcefully dragged Rion away to the back lines, where she guarded him until the battle was over, growling and biting towards anyone that was willing to come between her and her objective. It seemed like she did everything she could to keep her mistress's second son alive, even temporarily kidnapping him away from the battle and threatening their own troops. Some tongues even spoke about the fact that she had wounded Northmen when she had desperately tried to drag Meager away from the midst of their horsemen, but Ricard had quickly silenced those rumors his son had quietly told him right before the meeting. An uncontrollable direwolf hurting Northmen was a horrendous story for morale, and Nymeria seemed placated now, although she refused to leave Rion's side. The silence that had come over his northern lords was deafening. All had lost kin here on the field today, and it showed into their sorrowful expressions. After a while, the Lord of Riverrun couldn't take it anymore and continued. The Reach's nobility's losses have been huge. The cream of its nobility has either died or surrendered here today, except for Lord Tarley and a select group of nobles under his command. A Riverlander squire handed him another list and he read off the names hastily scribbled upon it. Some of the most powerful rulers of the Reach died today, including those from Tyrell's closest circle. Lord Strold Hightower, Osgood Peak, Hobber Redwine, Alan Ambrose and Leo Tyrell of Brightwater Keep all perished on the field, as did Lords Ashford, Risley, Beesbury, Blackbar, Graceford and Footley and many of their family members, vassals and household knights. Almost as much have surrendered to us. We have in our captivity Lords Oakurt, Reading, Fossoe, Merryweather, Varner, Ligood, as well as the newly acclaimed Lords Blackbar, Ambrose and Ashford. Over 100 heirs, second and third sons, brothers, nephews and cousins have also put down their weapons. The only notable absentees are Lord Dickon Tarley and his heir, although he has lost his second son in battle to Lord John Whitefy, Lord Bulwer, Lord Humphrey Rowan and the newly acclaimed Lord Gordon Peake. We have vanquished the Reach forces. The way to Highgarden lies open, as do all the spoils that its bountiful lands have to offer. These pompous flowers have tried to weaken us by sowing dissent in our own kingdom, even in my own family. They have invaded our lands for nothing more than greed and selfish ambitions. Let them pay the price for it now. Let them feel what the Riverlands have felt. They wanted to loot us and neutralize our threat to them for generations. Well, let's turn the table on them now. When we're finished, nobody will see the Reach as a threat any longer. Hoster Tully roused the present lords. All the present nobles from the Riverlands, Stormlands and Vale cheered, while most of the northern lords looked broodingly at each other. He had to intervene. This was indeed a grand victory, and his countrymen shouldn't forget that, no matter how sad they all felt because many of their friends and family members had fallen. What Lord Tully is saying is true. He jumped in. We have all but defeated organized resistance in the Reach. This is a great victory. He spoke, as he took his place next to his Lord Paramount and his heir. For this victory, We have paid a steep price, which all the more compels us to make the most of it. The Reach is open, and it will feel our wrath. We have come here because we were forced into a war we did not want, but we shall not leave these lands until all have submitted to our demands. He waited for a second or two to make sure his words sunk in. We will break the last resistance and will enrich ourselves in doing so. We earned that right. Tonight, we will celebrate this hard-fought and well-earned victory. Tomorrow, we will honor and avenge the fallen, and we will loot enough of the wealth of the Reach to ensure that their children and their children's children will live far better lives in our home countries than their fallen fathers ever did. We will ensure that the Reach will never be able to threaten our lands again, not in our lifetimes and neither in the lifetimes of those children's children. After we are finished with them, the roses won't sport any thorns any longer. He cried out loudly. Now the Northern Lords joined in and screamed their agreement. He smiled his typical fake smile, a necessity as a king. All he could think of was going to see Jon's body, and finding a weirwood to pray in. Nevertheless, he would need to go see Edric. His nephew needed him, now more than ever. He would push down his own grief as much as he could and be there for Jon's son. It was what his brother would have wanted. Chapter 95, Licking Wounds. 29f. Lord Galbart Glover. He sat outside his grandfather's tent as he cleaned the royal armor in the hot midday sun. Around him the sounds of the camp could be heard. Cooks preparing the evening meal, men shouting as they won or lost at a game of dice and stable boys puffing under the weight of the bales of hay they were moving. All around him, banners fluttered in the wind, proud direwolves dancing in the light breeze as far as the eye could see. He tried to concentrate on cleaning the breastplate that he had in his hands and wanted to put all his frustration into his duties as a squire, but it didn't seem to be working. He just couldn't understand why his grandfather was acting like this. Why was he doing nothing? His father had been killed. Great-uncle Jon and cousin Benjen had been slain. Cousin Meager had been killed. Other nobles from all important families had also perished, and his grandfather did nothing. The battle had been 2 weeks ago, and they had hardly progressed 50 miles since. A distance they could normally travel in 2 or 3 days, as they faced no resistance. Grandfather spent half his days talking to cousin Edric or sitting alone in his tent analyzing the battle over and over again with only grey wind and ghost to keep him company. To make matters worse, he seemed to have turned more lenient towards their enemies than before, which was in direct contrast to the sentiment of all Northmen. Whilst he and most of their countrymen wanted to burn the whole Reach down, his royal grandfather seemed to have turned softer, as if his fire had suddenly burned out. Luckily, Uncle Ricard was still here. His uncle, who was also in the middle of grieving for the loss of his family and friends, had taken charge of many things in their host. Many of the Northmen had seen in the Crown Prince a way to express their worries and frustrations. He had also gone out of his way to talk to both him and Rion, asking how they were and grieving together with both of them about the loss of father and cousin Meager. Still, his frustration kept rising day by day, and he wasn't the only one. More and more disgruntled nobles were visiting Prince Ricard every day from all over the north and even parts of the Riverlands. He hadn't been idle himself either. This morning his late father's younger brother, Uncle Ethan, had organized a meeting. One of the few good things that his grandfather had done since the battle was promoting Uncle Ethan to the active commander of the Glover forces. After the death of his father, he had become the head of his house at only 12 years old. He didn't know how to lead, he was too young, and he couldn't combine it with his duties as a royal squire. His uncle Ethan helped him with this and commanded the troops in his name. He also helped him out with grievances, but didn't overstep any bounds. This morning, he had gathered other disgruntled kin on his father's side, the Woolfields and the Foresters. The Woolfield heir, Brandon, had also fallen in the battle. Brandon had been married to his aunt Irina Glover, and their children, his cousins, were Brandon's heirs. Brandon's father, Lord Manfred, and his 2 younger brothers, Bernard and Walton, were fuming about the king's lack of action. Lord Edmund Forester had also died, his heir Gerhard Forester also eager to avenge his father's death. His uncle Ethan had married Gerhard's sister, and the relations between him and his, now lordly, good brother were excellent. However, many of his disgruntled maternal Stark kin had also attended. Lord Cleesewin, the king's own good brother, had asked the king for permission to go and burn down Longtable 3 times now, and thrice he had been refused. Lord Clee's second son and new heir, Rion, had also been there. After the loss of cousin Meager, both were adamant on revenge. Vassals, and members of other befriended houses had also been present, most notably Ned Umber, Ed Eric Dustin and members of clans Val, Berkeley and Liddell. Together they had agreed to position the king to allow them their revenge, hoping that their numbers would aid them to success this time. They would do so in private, as not to challenge his authority. No, grandfather had an almost mythical status among his kin and countrymen, but they would challenge his recent decisions in private. As his vassals, they had the right to do so. Soon, Uncle Ethan would arrive here with the others to meet with grandfather. The audience had been formally requested and accepted, and Uncle Ricard had promised to also be present. His nerves were driving him crazy. Would grandfather relent? Would he be mad at him for pursuing vengeance against the Reachman? Would he dismiss him as his squire? So many questions ran through his head. He tried to shake them off, as he put the royal chest plate back after it was finished. He picked up his grandfather's helmet, and wiped it clean with a dry cloth first. After having removed all the dirt and debris, he picked up a wet cloth from his bucket and went to work, careful to not scratch the metal. In rhythmic strokes he continued his work, until he finally saw a group of men approach. His great-uncle Torren, the commander of the Wolf's Guard, stopped them and told them to wait in front of the tent, as he walked inside to tell the king of their arrival. He immediately stopped cleaning the helmet, almost jumping up, but Uncle Ricard gently, but firmly, put a hand on his shoulder and pressed him down again. "I can understand your eagerness to join us, nephew, but it does not excuse leaving the royal armor unattended in the middle of our camp. You can clean it after the talks, but you need to put it back where it belongs before you can attend." He sighed but nodded. His uncle was right, of course. Whether or not his grandfather would be angry on him for the purpose of their talks he could not know for certain, but he would certainly scold him for leaving his personal armor unattended. He picked up the helmet and ran with it into the royal armory tent. By the time that he got back, the others had already entered. Great-uncle To silently stepped aside as he approached, signaling that he was allowed to enter. When he entered the tent, he saw how everyone who had attended their morning meeting had already taken a seat, with Prince Ricard sitting symbolically at the king's right side. Next to the prince there was an open seat, and his uncle motioned for him to claim it as his own. He looked puzzled to his uncle, but his grandfather waved it away. "The head of House Glover always deserves a seat of honor, as do any of my grandsons. You deserve it twofold. Now sit down, Galbart, so we can start this meeting." King Robb Stark ordered him, and the recognition that his grandfather gave him made him puff out his chest. He looked around the table, as he sat down. In front of him sat Lord Manfred Woolfield, and between him and the king sat Lord Sewin. Next to Lord Woolfield sat Ned Umber, then Ed Eric Dustin, and then the clansmen of House Val and Berkeley, and Rion. To his own right sat his uncle Ethan, Lord Forrester and then Lord Liddell. Well, his grandfather scoffed, as he looked around the table. "Get on with it. I know you have prepared what you have to say. We are all Northmen here, no need to sugarcoat any of this. I am no southern flower that will get offended by your grievances. You have received your audience, now use it." The king's bluntness would be unsettling to many, but not to these men. They appreciated it more than anything. To his right, Uncle Ethan started speaking. "Your Grace, we have been asking ourselves why we have not fully taken advantage of our victory these past 2 weeks. We have won a pivotal battle, and the Reach is awfully crippled, if not terminally wounded, because of it. Yet, we are not capitalizing on it. All the men in this room have paid a horrible price for this victory, you and yours included. We would not want to see it go to waste." All men grumbled their approval, and he joined in. "What would you have me do then?" Grandfather replied. "Pick up camp and force march everyone to High Garden." "No, Your Grace." Lord Sewin shook his head. "We want you to do as you have done since you and I were but simple children, heirs to our lordly fathers. We want you to lead. There is no army commander more talented nor experienced than you are. We have our own ideas, yes, but we would not mind you making other arrangements, as long as something happens. We want to stop crawling up the Rosa Road like this. It seems eerily familiar to the tales of King Renly Baratheon's march the other way 3 decades ago, albeit in lesser spirits. We do not want to suffer the same fate as Renly did. Your vassals want you to act, our allies want you to act. All men nodded. I would follow you to ruins of Valyria without hesitation, your grace. What I will no longer do is be content to sit here and do nothing while our enemies regroup. Lord Liddell gruffly added, which was followed by a chorus of ayes, resounding from every side of the table. His grandfather's face betrayed nothing, as he looked around the table before settling on Lord Sewin. You spoke of plans of actions. Are there any others than you attacking Longtable? Lord Clee nodded. We split up the army. King Robb just cocked his eyebrow. We split up the army. Ned Umber, Lord Smalljan's younger brother, answered. We split up the army. It is too large, which makes it inert and cumbersome.